The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes with Plein Air and Fine Art Connoisseur magazines, and I love landscape painting. I do landscape painting, and I always try to find the best landscape painters to teach you. John MacDonald is a tonalist, and he has such a great process for creating paintings. You're going to really enjoy it. This one is called Poetic Landscapes.
Hi, I'm John MacDonald. I'm delighted to be here filming this instructional video. I hope you find it informative and beneficial to your painting. The painting process you're going to see that I use has evolved over the last 20 years or so, as much by accident as by intent, from talking to painters, being given advice by fellow painters, reading books. At the core, it's a very traditional method that goes back a couple centuries. I don't have any secrets to offer. Special formulas for a media that will make your paintings glow like a Vermeer's, or a certain brand of brushes that will make you paint like Sargent. Personally, I believe that we can most effectively and efficiently improve the craft of our painting by deepening our understanding and mastering the basics, composition, values, color, etc. And if you think of a concert pianist, they will play scales 3 or 4 hours a day. I was always amused by the fact that preceding every World Series game, the baseball teams would begin their day with batting practice, the same thing they did as kids in Little League. So the basics, it is the basics that are important in this world, our field of endeavor, as it is in many others. So I have no secrets to give you. What I'm going to be doing is briefly explaining some concepts, then hopefully showing them to you during the demo. I'll go into greater depth while I'm actually painting. And then you're going to have to try them out. Videos, books, magazines, there are a lot of ways we can learn about art and improve our skills. Going to conventions, attending workshops, all of that is very beneficial. But ultimately, we learn to paint by painting. It's the only way to really make any kind of learning effective. We have to try it out. So take from this method that I use, take what works for you and ignore what doesn't. And if you find some things that I do extremely beneficial, they click for you, and it makes your painting more efficient and more joyful, that's wonderful. And if they don't, that's wonderful too, because often it's just as beneficial to know what doesn't work for us as it does what does work for us. So let me talk for just a minute about using photographs as reference, because that's what I'm going to be doing in this demo. And I know that it can be a controversial subject among landscape painters, especially those who paint exclusively plein air. I think there are some advantages to using photographs to paint. I think the greatest advantage is simply time. A photograph, given that a photograph will not change while we're sitting in the studio, and we have all day to work from it, that time is a luxury, and we can spend all the time we need analyzing the composition, studying the value structure, looking at color relationships, taking this image, this raw visual information we have in the photograph, and tearing it apart and rebuilding it as a painting. So time is an advantage. Another advantage is simply the fact that we can capture ephemeral weather conditions and times of day that we could never paint in plein air. Dusk, dawn, an approaching storm, the certain light across a snowy field, clouds moving, light on water. There are an awful lot of times we'll be on location, out in the landscape, wanting to paint a certain scene, but it simply doesn't last long enough to do so. In that case, I think cameras are very effective. In terms of the visual information you capture with a camera, as long as you use them properly, in other words, take photos intelligently, which usually means taking photos from different angles, different views, and particularly different exposures. Making sure that when you find a scene you love, you shoot at least three shots, exposing for the lightest lights, which is usually the sky, the darkest darks, maybe the shadows in a tree, and those mid-values of a meadow or lights on the trees. So as long as we take photos intelligently and for the sole purpose of gathering information, I think a photograph can give us adequate information for the values, the lights and the darks in the scene. I also think that a photograph records all the details you could possibly need, and in most cases far too many details. But I don't think that our ability to memorize where every leaf was on every tree, we can't do that. So a photograph is a great help for when you just want to capture a lot of detail. So the advantages: time, capturing ephemeral conditions, and values, capturing values. And details. That's the advantages of using a photograph. Are there any disadvantages? Of course there are. And the greatest disadvantage really is in terms of the quality of the visual information is color. The camera cannot begin to match the human eye for seeing subtle and nuanced color relationships. The colors in the sky, the colors in water. I often love painting landscapes in the winter, and too often in a snow scene, what I see is a bluish, purplish gray with maybe tints of green and pink is reduced in the camera to a simple flat blue. Often the same thing happens in the sky. Subtle nuances of warm, cool tones in the sky are simplified by the camera into just a flat cobalt blue. So there are disadvantages, certainly. The greatest disadvantage, I think, of using a camera to record information, though, is that the camera doesn't record emotions. It doesn't record how you feel in this scene. And I think that's a hugely important component of painting a landscape. How we feel about this scene, how we connect to it, our emotional response to it often informs the way we paint. And when it's painted successfully, I think those emotions, as subtle as they may be, can often affect the way it's not only painted, but the viewer sees it. The viewer can feel that emotional response in the painting. The camera captures the scene, but it is a frozen, mechanical copy, soulless copy of what we're seeing. It captures none of the movement of clouds, wind in the fields, water, the way water ripples, nor does it capture our emotional response to the scene, which I think is a huge deficit. Let me talk too, just briefly, about copying versus creating. Painting is not a spectator sport. To learn, to do it, to enjoy it, we have to be painting. And we are painters. We're not newspaper reporters. We're not making a documentary of a scene or a copy of a scene. We're creating a painting. So where I would completely agree with those who say you cannot use photos as reference, you cannot use photos as reference if all you're going to do is copy the photo, detail for detail, value for value, color for color, because you're copying what is essentially already a copy and perhaps a deficient copy of the landscape that's out there. So please, use photographs as visual reference, as raw material to build your painting, as an architect would use bricks to build a building. No one mistakes those bricks for the building. Well, don't think that when you take a photograph, that by copying it, you're going to produce a good painting. No, the photograph is just a piece of raw material used by an artist with creative thinking and processes to build a painting. So what is a painting? A painting is a construction. It has parts, components, and a process. Different artists have different lists of what the parts of a painting is, but most 4, 5, 6 items, most agree on the essentials. And they are composition, values, or more specifically a value structure, colors, more specifically color relationships, edge contrasts, and details. Those are what I see as the 5 components of a painting. But what's crucial to understand is that these are not all equal. There is a hierarchy among these components. First and foremost, and most important, is the composition. So if we consider a painting as a pyramid, the composition would be the base layer of that pyramid. It determines the footprint, it also determines the strength of it, and it has to be strong. If the composition does not work, if the base layer of a pyramid doesn't work, the whole thing crumbles down. Secondly of importance would be the values, and in particular the value structure. The value structure is the 2 to 5 shapes that make up the composition assigned a light or a dark, from white to black, and along the gray scale. So when I say value structure, I'm really meaning those shapes that make up the composition, each one assigned a value between white and black. That's the value structure. That is, together with the composition, those two are the most important components of a painting. They are what hold the painting together. It expresses the composition, light, space, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So composition, value structure. The third most important component in a painting is the color. Now the color, of course, is what's sexy in the scene, and it seduces us as artists. That's what we love to get to. But it's not the most important component of a painting at all. Most important is composition, coupled with the value structure, then color. Edge contrast, by edges I simply mean where 2 large shapes meet. Is that edge soft? Is it hard? Or is it lost entirely? How fuzzy is it? So where a hill or a mountain range meets the sky, how do you treat that edge? Edge contrasts. And of least importance, and maybe you can barely read that, which is appropriate, is details. The details tend to be the least important aspect of a component insofar as making a painting that works, that has a structure that is strong and reads quickly and well and has energy and life. Details are often associated with telling maybe a little story or showing scale, but they tend to be the least important component of a painting. The problem is most artists, beginners and advanced artists alike, often when we're seeing a scene or working from photographs, we're attracted to both color, maybe some edge details, edge contrast, but a lot of details. So if we start our painting based on the details in the scene, we're essentially trying to build a pyramid from the point up. And what happens? It's going to collapse. And our painting will collapse too. It simply is not sustainable. So when we start the process, this painting process, we need to keep that hierarchy in mind. And why not? Why not structure a painting process that follows that hierarchy? So my painting process is approximately 7 steps, the first 3 of which don't even involve touching a brush. I choose the scene, and crucially, I ask myself, why did I choose this scene? What is it out there that I'm connecting with that I want to put into paint? So I choose the scene. I then gather as much information as I can. I will if I have the camera, take multiple photographs from various viewpoints, different exposures. If I have the time, I'll take a sketchbook along and do some tonal thumbnails, small little sketches to help me start to analyze the composition and even the value structure. I'll also do a plein air sketch if I have time and the inclination, a color sketch in oil. Not looking for a finished painting, just trying to record the color information that the camera can miss. And sometimes I'll take a movie. I find that strangely enough, taking a movie, I'm not taking it for visual information. I'm using the sound capability of recording my voice. So I'll take a movie, and while shooting the scene, I will describe in words what I'm looking at. I'm seeing the sky. It's got peach tones at the horizon. I'm seeing greens above that. In other words, I'm describing colors that I know the eye can see that the camera cannot. And this really has 2 functions. One, it serves as verbal notes to myself. Yes, I am seeing peach tones in that snow, and the shadows are deep ultramarine blue. So when the camera shows them as a light cobalt blue, no, I know they're deep ultramarine blue. So it not only gives me very concrete, specific color notes, but in the process of narrating the movie, I'm taking time and having to look at that scene closely enough to be able to describe it. So it's another layer of my spending time on the scene and learning and absorbing more and more of that information. So I choose the scene, I gather information, then I head into the studio. And there I will edit the photographs in Photoshop, change whatever I need to do. But the point of that is not so much to create a single photograph to copy and paint, as much to capture as much as I can the memories that I felt at that time of the scene. So I'm editing photographs. I'm going to take the sketches I drew, and maybe combine them, retrace over them, cut and paste them, playing around with the composition. I might tweak the color sketch that I did plein air, study more closely those colors. Is that really what I remembered about the color of that sky or the field? So I'm editing the information, and at the end of that, what I want to end up with is enough information about the value structure and enough information about the color to proceed to the painting. So then with the canvas on the easel, I'll sketch out the composition, and then I'll create a monochromatic underpainting in oil for the sole reason of both capturing the composition but also establishing the value structure. When that underpainting is dry, it's usually a day or two, I will then go in with color, laying in color, and while working color, I manipulate the edges, playing with edge contrasts, and tend to finish the painting with the details that I need, and that's the key word there, the details that are essential to the painting. Okay, so I'd like to show you now the materials that I use. Currently, I'm using a limited palette, and well, I have been probably for 8 or 10 years. When I first began, I limited it was even more drastically limited. I'm currently using a white that is half zinc and half titanium. And the reason for that is very simple. Titanium is a very opaque white that dries quickly with a very stable and strong paint film. That's all good. However, because it's so opaque, in higher toned mixtures, if you want a very, very light pink or yellow, the opaqueness gives it a chalkiness that I don't like. So I like the mixture of the zinc. Zinc white is translucent. It dries slowly, but it also dries with a very brittle paint film. You should never use pure zinc white in your paintings, especially if you paint thickly. The paint film will crack. I've been told that zinc in the titanium and zinc white mixture is the closest non-toxic alternative to lead, the traditional lead white paint. But it's a nice paint to use. I use Gamblin. I know other makers other brands have the same kind of mixture. Any brand will do. In terms of my yellow, I use a cadmium yellow light pure from Utrecht. Also cadmium yellow pale is another name for, I think, a very, very similar color. I think any brand will do. My blue is a Prussian blue. I use Winsor & Newton. Any brand will do. And the permanent alizarin crimson is also Winsor & Newton, and any brand will do on that as well. Not as many manufacturers make the permanent, but be sure to look for permanent, because alizarin crimson, traditional alizarin crimson, is not light fast. And especially in high key mixtures with white, the pigment fades rather rapidly. So these were the three colors, in addition to white, that I used for a number of years. I was able to approximate earth tones, the siennas, the umbers, and even get a range of grays. But I spent a lot of time mixing to get it right. It was time well spent, I believed. I learned a lot about color mixing. But I think several years ago, I decided that it was time to maybe expand the palette a little bit more. So I also now use dioxazine purple. This is Utrecht, but any brand will do. You can mix a beautiful dioxazine purple from Prussian and permanent alizarin crimson that is almost identical. But I found myself using purple so often in so many of my mixtures that I found it simply easier to have a use a pre-mixed pigment. The last pigment that I've added to my palette for the last several years is Vasari Raw Umber. This allows me to start to mix neutrals, gray tones, earth tones, as a base. I can start with the Vasari Raw Umber, and by adding different things to it, I can approximate burnt sienna, raw sienna, and a beautiful range of grays. Now, I don't own stock in Vasari. I don't get any kickbacks for saying this, but I have used a lot of different raw umbers, and I find that most of them are slightly too yellow. Vasari, for whatever reason, is a more neutral raw umber, and when mixed with white, can produce a beautiful, coolish, silvery gray that I like very much. So those are the pigments. In terms of the brushes, I use two. The brushes that do most of the work are a bristle synthetic blend. This is a Utrecht F series. Sadly, a year ago, they discontinued the line, and I think I bought up most of what they had. Fortunately, I still have plenty of them. I am sure that a moderately priced synthetic bristle blend would do just fine. I'm very hard on my brushes. You'll see that I scumble a lot. I push the paint into the canvas. So for me to spend the money on an expensive brush, frankly, wouldn't make sense. I would destroy it, and I destroy these brushes fairly quickly. I wear them out. I use the flat. I like the longer bristles than a bright. It holds more pigment. I just like the feel of it, the bounce of it on the canvas. Towards the end of the my painting process, I'll often turn to these titanium Robert Simmons. It's a soft nylon synthetic brush. They're very nice. I'm sure that there are very many similar brushes from different brands out there. The reason I turn to these towards the end of the painting is often if I need a very sharp edge. I'm able to get a really clean, sharp edge with these brushes. I'm also able to lay the paint on the canvas very lightly, so if the paint thickness has built up a little bit, I'm not picking up the paint from underneath. I also use, and I think Utrecht sells this. This is just a very soft bristle brush that I use often to blend large areas of the painting. If I feel that the edge contrasts have become too hard, or I have too many subtle little value variations in the painting, I'll use this to blend it. I do tend also to use quite often a value scale. You'll see that during the demo, where I literally will mix a paint and put it right on the scale to see if my value mixture is accurate. In terms of solvents, I don't use them. I've over the last year or two have really moved toward a non-toxic studio. So what I use to thin my paints while I'm painting, and again you'll see that in the demo, is a mixture of 50% safflower oil and 50% linseed oil. It's similar to the zinc and titanium mixture in that linseed oil dries fairly quickly. It dries with a very durable and strong paint film, which is why it's been used for centuries, but it also yellows a little bit when it dries. The safflower oil dries more slowly. It forms a brittle paint film, so you really don't want to use it just all by itself, but it doesn't yellow. So I find that mixing it 50-50, I get a little longer time to work with it before it would get tacky, and it doesn't yellow, and it's a little more fluid, which I like working with. In terms of a medium, now I don't use a medium, and I should note quickly, no, this is not a tube of paint, and it's certainly not a tube of Utrecht zinc white. This is when I travel, I put the medium in a tube. Often at home, I simply have it in a jar. I do not use a medium as it's traditionally used to dip a little bit in with each paint mixture. So when I'm mixing my paints, I might use a little bit of oil. I don't use a medium. I'll show you how I do use it during the demo. But that consists of 1 part linseed oil, 1 part safflower oil, 1/2 part stand oil, 1/2 part Dorland wax, and a few drops of dryer. And I'll explain why the Dorland wax, why I use Dorland wax, again, when I use this during the demo. So those are my materials. I know that often you hear of certain brands giving you certain effects, and that is true. Magic medias, certain media giving you certain effects. All of that is true. But as I said, ultimately, if there was a magic tube of paint that said tranquility, or a magic tube of paint that said masterpiece, and by using that you were guaranteed a great painting, we would all be using it. This is the basics, and it's these materials that you'll use to build your paintings. So you need to master them. So having looked at my materials, let's start the demo. But before I do, I'm going to go into each one of these steps in greater depth. So my first step is choosing the scene, and particularly asking myself why I chose the scene. So this is a meadow that's not far from my house. I've painted it multiple times, probably done a fair share of plein air paintings, winter, summer, spring on this meadow. It's just one of my favorite spots. Why you choose a scene, it's important to understand why you choose a scene. And I should say first that I'm not a subject painter. That is, there are painters who are more interested in telling a story or a narrative in their painting. And if you're interested in painting, you know, an old tractor or an old barn, a street scene or a cafe scene, often that includes kind of a narrative element. You're kind of telling a story. I'm more of a formalist, I guess, for lack of a better word, in that I'm not so much interested in telling a story. What attracts me to a scene are color relationships and value relationships, and particularly the mood, the quality of light and the mood, which I guess if you argued, okay, well, that's kind of a story, isn't it? Yeah, I guess it could be. And I want to make sure, though, that you understand that I certainly don't look down on subject painters. It's just a different way of painting. And painting has plenty of room for all inclinations and styles. So what attracts me to this scene, I've passed by this so many times. It's not far from my house. I would often see the light in the winter coming across this field. I've painted it once or twice plein air. I have 15 minutes maybe before it changes completely. So this again is an example that I gave earlier when I said one of the advantages of painting from photos is its ability to capture the ephemeral moment. So that's what I had I just love the tranquility of this area, this field, and especially in the winter when it's absolutely silent, except maybe the sound of the wind in the trees. It's just an extremely peaceful, tranquil place to be. And had always wanted to capture this moment too in the sunset, having seen it so many times. Why do you need to go into depth about why I chose this scene? Well, because frankly, that is probably going to determine your focal point. If you ask yourself, what do I really love about this scene? That's going to be the center of interest in your painting. That's an extremely important thing to know because you're going to structure that painting around that focal point. So for me, what I was really just loved was the pattern of the trees and the light up in here. Yes, I thought the pattern of the grass coming through the snow was interesting, but this is primarily what I was interested in. So I've chosen the scene. Now I need to gather information. I probably took 25 or 30 photographs of this scene. I arrived early. I could catch the shadows as they crossed the distant field, as it would pick up certain trees and then disappear. Other trees would go into shadow. I was just intrigued by that play of light as time moved along. So I took a lot of photos, finally settling on this one. I also, I think, did one or two tonal sketches quickly. It was a pretty chilly evening at the time. Just a real quick little thumbnail, playing around with the value relationships. I have done plein air studies of this scene in the winter, but I didn't do one this time because I've learned that the sun just changes so quickly in the winter when it's low and going down at an angle to the horizon. It changes too quickly to really bother getting out your plein air kit when it's 20 degrees outside. So I gathered the information, photos, sketches, a plein air sketch, can't remember if I took a movie of this or not. I may have, in which I'm describing the colors. But then I go back to the studio, and typically we'll download the photos in Photoshop. I'll set the sketches aside, a plein air aside, and I'll start to go through the photos, looking for what I hope will be a photo not that I can copy. I can't stress that enough. The point of using photographs is not to find one photograph you can copy, but a variety of photos that all give you visual information, and hopefully one photograph that can capture enough of the value relationships that you can use that as information regarding the values and the details. As I mentioned, that being, I think, the best advantage of using a photo. But when I take a photo into Photoshop, I take it further than just saying, oh, this is the photograph I want to use. Because of my experience as a former freelance illustrator, I'm comfortable in Photoshop, and I will often crop the photograph And I didn't crop it much this time, as you can see, just zoomed in a little bit. But then I will change the values and the color in Photoshop. And again, the point isn't to come up with one image, a photo, that I can just copy to make a painting. I want to try to recreate in me the emotion and the memory I had of that scene. So this is what I ended up with after altering it in Photoshop. You can see quite a bit of difference in the color. This may have been the actual color of the scene. I don't know. It may have been, but it's not how I remembered it, and it's not what I was responding to. I saw this as much more of a scene of glow with color contrast, and I simply wanted to capture as quickly as I could that memory. So while I was painting, I would be painting from my memory with this as a reminder rather than from that as simply a photograph. And I hope you understand that, how important that distinction is. So in Photoshop, I've taken this image and I said, yeah, that's really much more that's much closer to how I remembered it. And then typically, still in Photoshop, I will paste a grayscale next to the photo and a little thumbnail above. I paste the thumbnail because it's so much easier to see the basic shapes and basic values of a photograph on the computer monitor when it's kept small. It's much more difficult, I think, when it's enlarged, and I use a monitor in my studio about this size. So this may be great for seeing detail, but it's much easier to see as looking at a small image. It's a little bit like a thumbnail sketch. It gives you the basic shapes and some of the basic values. So with the value scale, what I'm doing is I'm taking samples of the colors of the landscape. Sometimes I'll actually, with just one of the Photoshop tools, select a square of the actual photo. Other times I'll simply fill in a little square with the color that I sample. I'm really looking for value information. I used to, 5 or 10 years ago when I was doing this, I would almost always convert the photograph to black and white and then do the same thing. Now I like to go directly to color, in part because it's good training to look at a color and where is this on the value scale, to judge the value of color immediately rather than having to convert it to black and white. But if you have the capability of converting it to black and white and that helps you, by all means do. So by assigning these chips from the little samples from the photo, I can see exactly where these values lie on the value scale. And it gives me the information I need to establish the value structure. I've shown you the value scale, the thumbnail, but what changes exactly did I make, and maybe why? Well, let's start at the top. In the original photo, you'll notice the sky is blue. That cool sky, yes, that cool sky could create great color contrast with the warmer tones here. But I was thinking in some ways of this painting as being a warm key painting above and a cool key painting below. And if you don't understand color keys, if that's confusing, I will get to that. But I changed the sky just because I thought it would, that's how I remembered it, but I thought it could make for a more interesting image in terms of color contrast. You'll notice also I pumped the color in some of the shadows. I wanted to see a little more color in the shadows. I lightened some of the darker shapes in the foreground. In terms of the snow itself, photographs often record snow, especially snow and shadow, as being far too blue. It's not how I remembered this. I remembered this because of the warm light coming and being reflected from the background into the foreground snow. I remember the snow being much warmer and a little bit lighter. You'll notice also, though, in Photoshop and the airbrush tool, I simply painted out a lot of that foreground snow. I wanted to just see, did I need all this pattern? At first, at the beginning when I saw this scene, I was actually interested in and intrigued by that pattern of the grass breaking through the snow. But as I'll explain when I talk about details, every little detail that's down here is going to be screaming for attention and to the detriment of the details up here at the focal point where I really need them. So I just painted them out very quickly, just to get a sense of how much detail do I want in the snow in the foreground and how much don't I. But before I move on to what I do with the sketches, let me say a word about Photoshop. You do not need Photoshop or any image editing software to make better paintings or to use photographs as reference. I've seen a lot of people using an iPad where you can convert it to black and white. You can change the colors, the values with an iPad. All of that is just a tool to explore the color and value relationships. If it helps you see it with fresh eyes and deepens your understanding of it, then use it. Just don't copy it. It's just raw, again, it's raw information, and it's there to help me come to an understanding of these value relationships rather than giving something that I just blindly copy. But don't get hung up about Photoshop. I use it because I had it as an illustrator and I know how to use it. You can simply print out a photograph, and if you'd like, you could hold a value scale. Simply hold the value scale up to the photo and decide and discover where these values are. But all of this, because remember the pyramid, composition, value scale, they're the most crucial elements of your painting. If you can nail those, 80% of the work of the painting is finished. So this is the photograph, and this is what I typically end up with on my monitor next to the easel when I'm thinking of painting. So what do I do with the sketches? Well, I'll cut and paste sketches. I'll enlarge them. I think on this I simply blew it up and printed it out. With the sketches, I really am looking for information on the shapes. I assigned values to these, but this is the value information I'm going to use when I paint. This is for composition, to play around with different shapes. How does this tree line work? And in particular, I was concerned about the way this pattern of shapes in the foreground moved into the background. So that's editing the information. I've gathered it. I've chosen the scene, I've gathered the information, back to the studio, I've edited what I've needed, and I've ended up with a good sense of the value structure of the painting and a good sense of what I need to do with the composition. So at this point, I would simply transfer this sketch to here. I wouldn't bother with this until I need value information, because this is what I'll use for the composition. Okay, so I have what I need. I have the value structure in the photograph and the compositional sketch, the shapes, the arrangements in my larger tonal thumbnail. So we can start transferring that to the canvas. But first, let me just talk about composition. And it's so important, and so sometimes it seems so complicated that I'm sure you could shoot an entire video doing nothing but just exploring and talking about composition. And again, composition is that arrangement of the major shapes of the landscape into a scene that feels unified, but also is varied. I think the word I tend to use more than anything else is it wants to feel balanced, a composition, and yet have a variety of shapes. I find it a lot easier to say what not to do when composing a scene than what to do. Some of the things you want to avoid are placing anything of real strong interest, strong contrast around the edges. Traditionally, they've always said never put anything, certainly not the focal point, dead center. It usually needs to be slightly off center. I think one of the more important rules is you always want to avoid equal divisions of the canvas. If I had a sky and a field, I don't want to have that horizon line exactly in the middle, nor do I want to split the canvas down the middle vertically. But also you want to avoid having equally sized shapes on the canvas. So if I have, say, a band of trees across here, and I have a lake or a pond down here, I don't want that pond and those trees to be the same width on the canvas. It kills the illusion of space. So one of the most important rules that I'm always trying to avoid, and it's amazing how easy it is to forget it, that rule of avoiding equal size shapes on your canvas. Most rules that you'll hear about regarding composition can be broken. George Inness used to divide, especially his late canvases, would divide his canvas in the middle and then right down the half, but then hang different elements around that central cross beautifully. You'd never really know that he was violating one of the cardinal rules of composition. Don't divide your canvas in half vertically or horizontally. He did it both and got away with it. There are, I guess, masters who can break those rules. I think there is one rule, though, that is absolutely inviolable, that you cannot break, and that is don't say more than one thing with your composition, with the painting. Make sure that if you have a focal point, you don't have another focal point of equal strength here or here. Think of it as someone telling you a story. Well, if there's only one person telling you a story, it's easy to follow. If you have three people talking simultaneously, surrounding you, each telling a different story, how can you possibly make sense of that? It's the same thing with the painting. Say one thing with the painting and sacrifice everything else. It also isn't just a focal point. It's not uncommon to find a painting in which the sky is spectacular, beautiful variations of values and colors, and you want to capture that sky. But boy, the light on the hills is also incredible. Wow, I want to capture that. And while I'm at it, look at the light on the foreground, snow or field. I want to capture that too. Well, what you end up doing is giving me three paintings, a beautiful sky and then this incredible scene here. And especially if you're giving them equal weight in color contrast, value contrast, you're saying three things with one painting. Instead, maybe have the hills down here, simplify them, and concentrate on the sky. When you're finished with that painting, start another one, where maybe the sky is simplified and it's just a little band up top, and then you spend all your time painting the field. Don't try to say more than one thing with one painting. So composition, from the composition, I'll now transfer the lines here. But first, let me just show you what I use for an underpainting. Typically, I prefer using burnt sienna with just a little bit of the burnt umber. I will add burnt umber only if I really need a dark shadow that I'm unable to get with the burnt sienna. You can see that burnt sienna is slightly lighter than the raw umber. I will typically use the same white that I've used, the 50% zinc mixture and 50% titanium. So typically I'll begin with just a slightly diluted bit of burnt sienna and maybe just a touch of white. I don't want to have the lines too dark. And then I'll begin transferring the line looking at my sketch. So first thing is, where do I want, I think what's most important in this scene is really the line of those hills where the snow is, meeting the background edge of trees. Now, I'm tempted as I look at this, even though I've just designed this sketch and I think the composition works, I'm tempted to raise that maybe up a little higher. Not sure. It's, again, the beauty of an underpainting is that because you're keeping the edges soft and very little detail and working really just with the major shapes, you can tweak this till as long as you want and until you're really happy with it. So maybe that line of hills, there's a little variety. This is a more gentle slope. This is a little more abrupt. I like that contrast. And then it comes down maybe into the foreground and out this way. Or maybe actually I think that this should probably move here. Okay, so maybe I'll curve this line a little bit here. Just at this point, absolutely not concerned with any details, just the major shapes. That maybe goes here. I want to be careful how close I come to that edge. I want to show some sky. And I don't know if it shows up clearly in the video, but I have essentially reproduced the same grid on my canvas as I have on the sketch. So I can at least use those as guides. Maybe this comes down here and breaks up. I'm going to break there's a little tree in the photograph, kind of more in the foreground. In the sketch, you can just barely see it, just to the left of center. I want to have that break that line. And there are some mid-ground trees that are breaking the horizon line there. Want to make sure that this has some variety. Should I avoid having this go off at the same height from the edge here? You know, I think it's often I would say yes, but I think in this case it's not critical because I'm going to have these trees in the break that edge, and also they'll be a little higher. So I'm going to pull that down just a little bit. Again, just working in line now. You always want to avoid lines lining up. If the angle of this tree The tree row is exactly the same angle as that. It starts to make this shape read flat, and the brain wants to read it as a flat plane perfectly perpendicular to your view, and it flattens it out. So always trying to make sure that this curve, curves don't repeat themselves. I have a curve here, I have a curve here. One of those is going to have to change. So why don't I maybe bring this here? And you might kind of wonder why I didn't solve this at the sketch stage, and I'm kind of wondering that too at this moment. You would think I would have caught that, but that's all right. At least I caught it now before it hurt the composition. I'll bring that up a little bit. This line is a very important line in the sketch, where this edge comes in, how far it comes down. There's a triangle there that's nice. I want to make sure that this isn't symmetrical. You don't want to have forms that are perfectly symmetrical on your canvas. That's another rule of composition. So I'll break that edge up. This can be a nice clean edge since it's an edge of snow. And then some of those bush forms or brush forms, whatever it is, move up here. This line, see, that just breaks that midline, then it comes up, comes down this way, just below half. I need to make sure that the line between the foreground snow and those mid-ground bushes or shrubs is not exactly at halfway up the canvas. And I've actually maybe moved it down even a little more than in my sketch, but just by so little that I don't think it matters. I have a slight drop in the form as it comes here. I'm tempted to maybe make that straight across, just so I have a little variety, a single horizontal line maybe where all these are other lines are angles. I don't want to position it exactly in the middle though. Up here, and then another important line is this in the background. There seems to be a field that's almost flat. Then it rises as it comes along here. And I should say, again, just to repeat myself, I'm looking at the sketch now. I'm not really looking at the photo at all. When I paint start working in values, I'll look at the photo, and it may be then that I see things in the photo that I hadn't noticed previously in the sketch. Well, I'll change it then if I think it's going to help the composition. It's all about establishing a composition right now that works, that's going to allow me to convey a sense of space and form and just interesting shapes, the way these shapes come together. Let's see, well, that's a little too dark at this point, although this is all going to be fairly dark. Okay, and what's also probably I need to put in right now are this background, just so I can really get a sense of where this is. Now, this tree kind of comes up, and then I have a tree breaking into that about there. This shadow of the trees is maybe approximately here, and then there are some more shadows up in there. Don't need to indicate that right now. This is an important line because I have to decide how much of this field in the background I'm going to show. And can you see that this shape, or I'm working on this shape right here, this is the bottom edge of some trees. This is the top edge of the snowy field. There is a row of trees in here. Can you see that if I divide this equally, this to here, here to here, it's going to hurt the illusion of space. For some crazy reason, our brains will just interpret two shapes that are similar in width on our canvas as being in similar areas in space. So I want to avoid that. The tree here, and then there is just a tiny hint of that field or that slope of snow back through there, a little triangle there, and a little bit here. Now this kind of looks, these shapes now, it's a little hard to keep track of them because there are so many little ones. I'm not going to worry. If you look at the sketch, you can see a little line of a field up through here. I'm not even going to put that in. I can pull that out as I put in the values. But right now I'm just still wanting to indicate some of these shapes. I think that as I have used underpaintings more and more, I really enjoy this stage because I feel as if the brush is a pencil, and sometimes it's just really fun to, if I want to, just to kind of scumble in some of the shapes, even though I'm going to end up doing this much more accurately when I lay in the values. It can help me get a sense of how these shapes are going to look against the snow. Okay, I'm seeing at least variety. Not exactly sure what's happening over here. I need to maybe make that a little bit stronger. Watch, I want to make sure that the widths of these bushes are not the same, the height's not the same, the way I'm dividing the fields and layering this as it's going back in space is not the same. There has to be variety. Things have to be different. And it doesn't, does it really matter if you adhere to perspective principles that things large get smaller? Well, sometimes, but sometimes that regularity, especially if it's a field, gets kind of boring. Maybe one distant field is a lot larger, so it breaks that regular progression of getting smaller in space. And the darks are up in here. Okay, I think at this stage, I can forego the sketch and simply focus now on the monitor. So I'm working on a tone canvas now. So the first thing I want to do is identify this tone in terms of its value. Is there a reason to work on tone canvas than white? Typically, I like working on tone canvases, especially if I don't do a tonal underpainting, for the simple reason that especially at the beginning, if I'm working on white, every layer of paint, regardless of what value it is going to appear darker than white. So I find it harder to judge value relationships on the canvas until I get some of that white covered, a lot of that white covered. So I enjoy working on a toned canvas for the very reason that it knocks that white back. And then I can push the shadows in and pull the lights out. Often, though, in the studio, if I'm working on especially a large underpainting, and it's almost always the large paintings, I will always do a tonal underpainting on large paintings. I tend to prefer working on white because then I can lay the paint in, and rather than having to mix white to get lighter tones, I simply with a rag will pull off the oil, revealing the white canvas underneath. It's a different way of working, and if you want to try underpaintings, and I really recommend you do, especially if you struggle understanding values, then try both, working on both a toned and working on a white underpainting. Why do I need to identify this value? Well, it's probably going to be one of the values that I have identified in the value, on the value scale. And if that's the case, then I can use that as kind of a reference point to all my other values. So I typically will hold up a value scale to the canvas, and I hope you know by now the best way to distinguish values is to squint. It's the easiest way to see if two colors are the same value, or simply to see value shapes. So if I squint at this, it's clear that this is a little darker than here, it's getting close here, and maybe this is a little bit lighter. So I suspect it's going to be this value. I realize that this value scale and the value scale I have created in Photoshop don't correspond perfectly. Photoshop is because its photo sensors is actually shining white light for the white. It's going to be whiter than this. And this is printed ink pigment, which is never as dark as it really is with the pigment I can get from my oils. So it's not going to be quite this dark. It's just a little compressed. Is that difference critical? Not really, because what I'm most interested in analyzing values aren't the absolute value of a shape, that is, whether it's this dark or this dark or this dark, it's the relationships but it has with other values. It's those value relationships and how far apart they are on the value scale that make the difference. So if this value is approximately here, on my value scale it would be down around here. Well, that is the same value as the background of these trees here. Now, let me stop for just a minute to talk about, because I'm about to work values into this. Why do an underpainting? Why are values so important? And in fact, there's a great expression, not only that I've found not only in the world of painting, but my wife is a quilter, and I've heard quilters use it. Values do all the work, color gets all the credit. And I think that is absolutely true. Value does most of the work. Why do a value underpainting? Well, it's because it's value that creates the illusion of light. It's not color. Value creates the illusion of space. It's not color. And value creates the illusion of form. So if value is creating the illusion of light, form, and space, what else do I need to establish the composition and a structure to know that my painting is going to work? And if you think a painting has to have color to work, I recommend looking at the work of Charlie Hunter, who does terrific, beautiful paintings, monochrome paintings. Color has its place in a painting, and it does some wonderful things for a painting. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't provide structure, and it doesn't provide that spatial illusion that we're so often looking for in a landscape, where we want this tree to look further back and maybe a snow up in the foreground to look as if it's actually coming up into the foreground. So value gives us that. Another important aspect of value are value keys. Now, I could paint this entire painting in all dark keys and make the painting quite dark. Or I could decide to do a high key painting and make it entirely light in light values. In this case, I think just given the nature of the subject matter, I've got light shining on white snow and deep dark branches and bushes in shadow. I want to take full advantage of that value scale. So in this case, I think I'm going to be using pretty much most of the value scale, which frankly is a little easier than working in value keys. Because if you think about it, what I just said is it's not the absolute value that matters, it's the value relationship, the distances between them. Well, if I'm working from a full value scale from black to white, look at that range of values I have to work with. So if this is the value of one shape in the landscape and this is the value of another, and another one maybe is right here, I have some wiggle room in the value scale. I don't need to have that precisely exactly the same. But if I've compressed all my values so I'm working in the very light end of the value scale, I have much less wiggle room to make a mistake in that. So it's actually more difficult to work in high key, low key values, but it's worth trying. So there's one other very important component of value, and that is a gradient. And if you're not familiar with a gradient is a very subtle change in either value or color that moves from one area of a large shape to another. So just consider this large foreground area, and especially look on the left side in the photograph. Notice how the snow is light up to a certain point, slightly gets darker, and then noticeably darker by the time it gets up here. And in fact, even the snow in some of these areas is darker than it is here. Well, if you're looking at the value scale that I have next to the photograph, you can see on the right side, see those three chips of blue? That's essentially my mapping that gradient. The darker blue was up here, the middle blue is probably in the middle, and the lighter blue represents the value of the snow down here. Why are gradients so important? Well, anytime you have a flat surface, a plane in the landscape, receding, starting in the foreground and receding in the distance, or starting in the midground and receding in the distance, in order to give that the illusion that this is a flat plane receding into the distance, you have to change something as that goes back. So I'll just use this because it's so easy to see. It's almost half the painting. As I paint this snow has to start changing as it goes back here, or else this is going to look like a cutout flat shape that's perpendicular to me and not a flat shape receding in the distance. You'll see gradients in the sky. Notice, for instance, in my photograph, how when I put in the color in the sky, it's warmer here and cooler here. So this is a case where it's a gradient not in value, but in color. The sky changes from more orangish to here to a bluer color here. That's also a gradient. So it isn't just flat planes, and you'll always see gradients in the sky. And everyone's familiar with the gradient where it goes from light blue at the horizon to a dark blue up top. Well, it isn't just a change in value. Often it's a change in not only color, but in saturation, with duller colors at the horizon where there's dust and dirt and you're seeing through a lot of the atmosphere, and then the colors become a little cleaner and richer as you go up. So gradients work all over the landscape, and you need to train your eye to see them and expect them to be there. So We've got the reason we do an underpainting because of what value does in order to create a three-dimensional illusion. I'm looking for gradients in here, and in terms of the scale, the key of this painting, I'm just going to use full contrast. I'm not going to make it a low-key painting with mostly darks or a high-key painting with mostly lights. So I've identified my value as being the background trees, but notice on the left side of that value scale, look at the incredible gradient I have from the lights of the trees here, moving to a darker area of the trees here, and then in this area they start to drop into the shadows. And by the time the trees get here, they're almost black. Notice that change of a gradient in value and in color. In color, notice how they go from an orangish, pale orange up into some more greenish tones, well, not greeny, maybe ochre, yellow ochre, into more red tones in here. They start to pick up a little bit of purples and umbers in here, and then end up with a very cool, neutral, perhaps purplish, perhaps more umber. We'll get into that when I start dropping color into this. For right now, though, I'm thinking of value, and there's an unmistakable gradient from that background tree to the foreground shrubs. This gradient is really one of the things that made this scene most attractive to me. I wanted to work with the dark pattern of bushes, trees, and then as it goes up, it's getting lighter as it gets into the light, ending with a very light note in the trees here, a note that's the only note lighter than that light in the trees is really some of the lights in the sky, and that slash of almost white of the snow. So let's start working on the values. I'm going to use as large a brush as I can. And I will start, I think I'm going to start with that gradient because this light of the tree is actually lighter than here, so this is going to have to be lighter than this tone of the canvas. But for right now, let me take these darks, move them up, and then I'll stop right at this value because that's the value of the trees before they transition to being a little bit lighter. Both in the underpainting when I apply color and when I'm applying value now, this is not paint by numbers. The point of this isn't to define these shapes just perfectly and then stick with that. Yes, if I've designed this and it really is working perfectly, I probably don't want to make huge changes, but I don't need to make sure that my brush at this stage is coming up and matching exactly the lines of my sketch. Because if I do that, two things happen. Number one, it's monotonous and it's slow and it's not very exciting. It's just too uptight, maybe is a good word. There's no need. I can be a lot looser and have fun with this. It's just not that much fun. But for a more practical reason, if I'm painting right up to an edge on this shrub and then go back in with a slightly lighter snow and then go right up to that edge, on my canvas I'm going to have a little line of paint where those two areas of paint meet. When that dries, it's going to create a ridge of paint. Then when I go back into color, if I want to change that ridge, it's going to show through. Just because it's physically in the paint film, there's a little ridge of paint film. So I try to keep, especially the underpainting, keep the edges soft and the paint film thin. But by thin, I don't mean liquidy. I don't mean use a lot of the oil or medium. I mean thin as in a thin piece of fabric. It's not very thick. I want to put very little paint on the canvas. I want it to dry quickly. And I want to be able to manipulate it by wiping it off. So I'm just going to now, looking at both the sketch and the photo, start to block in some of these shapes that I had. Knowing that in the foreground they're going to be darker. I want to make sure I don't get too dark. It's so easy when the tone of this canvas is already darker than a 50% gray to end up with my darks a little too dark. The darker they are, the harder it really can be to put color into them. You're limited as to what kind of color you could put into it. Okay, so I'm just going to scumble this in. Let's see, that tree went up there, this one was here. This, as I started to say, having worked on the composition, you would think that you're going to have to match it exactly. But again, no. I consider this an opportunity to redraw the composition if I need to. if I find that it's just not working. Which hopefully I won't, because I've worked hard enough to get some of the shapes to work. But there are often little subtle changes that I never really know what's going to happen until I put them down in paint. Okay, so I think that the trees on this side, as in the photo, notice on the left side another gradient. Notice how the trees start dark over here and then they also get lighter. So this is the point where I'm going to start lightening this. I've got maybe a little too much oil in my brush. I'm going to get rid of some of that. I have a lot of oil on the palette right now. Now, I'm sure it appears that I'm putting down just one value. I'm not changing the value, and I had just talked about the gradient. And that's right. What I'm going to do is change that by wiping it. And by the time I get here, that's about the value I want for these trees. I use a paper towel a lot to paint with an underpainting. It keeps me from getting fussy, keeps me from working with details, being even concerned with details at all. And actually, I love sometimes just simply the effect I can get from just a paper towel, painting with a paper towel. It's a lot of fun. Notice the value of this shadow. It almost looks as if it's as dark as down here, but it's not, because it's against all of these lights. That's making it look darker. And in fact, I may even change that just a little bit, maybe make it deliberately lighter or deliberately darker as I continue the underpainting. But I'll have to wait and see. So that's the dark there. Then the trees get a little bit lighter here, maybe a little bit lighter along that ridge. I'm going to maybe exaggerate a little bit the shadow on this side, just so that I don't want it to be symmetrically, bookends. I don't want it to be like bookends, but just a little bit darker here will help the light up and the transition to the light up here be even a little more dramatic. And this light is quite light. Sometimes I'll see if it works. Occasionally, I will put a little drop of oil, there's a drop right there, on my paper towel, and I might be able to start to pick up some of that tone, depending on how dry it is. If I want to just start to experiment a little bit with that and becoming a little lighter. So I think it's happening just a little bit, probably not enough to make much of a difference in the underpainting, but keeping this fairly loose, that's going to be and then some of these darks, some of the shrubs on the hillside are coming up here. I want to just step back now and look at the shapes, making sure that these bands are not equally shaped. And I think at this point it's probably, maybe it's important to refer to my sketch, to have it nearby so I can just see if it's going to remind myself where I wanted to put some of these things. I think this mass could be a little bit larger. Maybe bring this down a little foreground. Again, I really have to make sure that these shapes are different widths as they come down, that I'm not aligning a tree here with a break over here. How large do I want to make that back meadow? Those were all questions I was asking myself when I was doing the sketch, and now I'm asking them again as I'm painting the underpainting. I think this angle, maybe soften that angle a little bit so it's not quite so dramatic. I'll break this up with just a few, dragging the paint, not getting too fussy about, no details. I'm going to push the darks, maybe add a little more dark. I don't know if I want to go I don't want to go to pure raw umber. But when I add color, if I have to, I could let this value be the shadows, slight subtle shadows in some of those bushes and shrubs, and then end up lightening it just a little bit. Now this is a little bit darker here, which I think is kind of nice, where these bushes climb up into this part of the hill. This should actually be lighter up in here, and I'm going to break that. Let's make that a little bit smaller. There is a light of that tree as it comes in front of the shadow. I like that transition. Have to be careful I don't have that tree come up right in the middle, which could look kind of a little strange, artificial. I think maybe I'll have the shadow go almost to the half point, a little further than was indicated in my sketch. Light there. This, of course, is going to be very light here. Now the sky color, looking at the value scale, if this is going to be the value of the trees, then the sky is noticeably lighter, but I have to leave a little room on that value scale also for the light of the snow. The light of the sky, those color chips, actually, it's amazing how just greenish yellow it looks and almost a greenish blue. And you'll see that they don't look nearly as light when pasted on my value scale as they do in the photograph. So I'm going to mix, let's put in the sky. I think that's going to be important to go to that light right now. Now, how do I know what value to mix then? Well, I will use the value scale, and I'll look at the value scale on the monitor and see that it needs to be a value. If I want to save some room on the value scale for nice whites in the snow, I really cannot go any lighter than, this says value 7. I mean, what is that, a 30% light or whatever, but that's the value I need. So I will literally have the value scale with me on the palette, and then when I need to match that value, well, I'll simply mix it and put a little bit of paint directly on the value scale, so I'm sure to get the values accurate. At this stage, if for me to have this underpainting work, I really need to have match the values as closely as I can to what I'm seeing on the screen, because I adjusted those to make the values work. I want to adhere to that. So mixing a little bit of white. This is the sky, so I'm not going to need an awful lot of paint. But I'm going to use, rather than any raw umber, I'm going to use straight raw sienna. Now, let me just show you quickly. I'm sorry, burnt umber, not raw umber. If I use the white with the raw umber, this is why I use raw umber only for the shadows. Notice how this actually starts to look a little cool, white with the raw umber, especially compared to the burnt sienna. So I don't want to have color contrast at this point, cool versus warm. I want to stick with as warm a colors as I can keep. And why do you use warm colors for an underpainting? Traditionally, it was always warm tones. Well, it's because often you use the colors of the underpainting to come through in places to tie the color of the painting together. Well, most colors in a landscape are cool, the blues, the greens, and what you end up with then is nice color contrast between the warm underpainting showing through the cool color added on top. If you do a cool underpainting, you're essentially trying to create color contrast with cool on cool, and it kills it. It just deadens the entire thing. So that's why we use warm colors for an underpainting. As I add white to this sky, often I will add just a little bit of yellow to keep it even warmer. Sometimes I would add a little cadmium orange. Experiment with the colors you add. You won't want to get too far away from just the basic warm tones of a sienna or orangish tones. So I've mixed this, the sky color. I'm going to literally put it right on my color scale. I'm going to squint, and I can see it just a little, which tells me it's just a little too dark. I'm going to add a touch of white to it, and that should take care of it. So that's going to be the value of my sky. Now, what I probably did is probably didn't mix enough, because I just realized that with a darker undertone, some of that undertone is going to show through. So I'll just quickly mix the same amount, matching what I had just mixed in value. That's very close, just a little bit of white. Just to make sure, I'll check again. And yes, that's awfully close to exactly what I need. Now the gradient, again, the gradient in the sky is a gradient in color, not in value. So this is a value underpainting. I don't really need to change this at all. I can just lay in just this single value for the sky. working this value in. The edges, as I said, I keep the edges very, very soft at this stage. I always am tempted to go in and actually, because I love finessing edges and playing with edges, especially trees against a light like a sky. But just resist the temptation, and it doesn't mean you can't suggest, well, maybe here, because these trees are breaking against the sky, it's going to be a little more loose and rough. That's fine. And here, where maybe it's coming against the trees, which almost look like a background hill, that's okay too. You know, you can play around with a little bit of variation if you'd like. I am having this tree, I believe, this tree break the line of that row of trees, so I'm going to remove some of my paint there. I often use my finger to keep edges soft. I find it a very, very quick and easy way, and again, it keeps me from getting fussy. At this point, I'm just not working on any details, not even thinking about details, just blocking in the values and starting to make sure that these shapes work as a composition. Working it over on this side. Now there are some trees that are coming up that are bare trees. That's something I'll probably put in when I actually paint in color. So I'll leave it out right now. If that tree, the tree on the very right side, there's a bare tree sticking up right here. If that were essential to the composition, I would probably put it in because I want to make sure it works. At this point, though, I'm not really too concerned about it. I'm keeping my brush strokes vertical because right now with the lights here in the studio, I'm getting some specular highlights on the brush marks, and it's actually making them look a little bit lighter in value. At this point, I just want a flat value here. I'm looking just for value. So not concerned about the brushwork, not concerned about details. Stepping back and saying, seeing if that's going to work as the sky. Now, it may be, as I look at this now, I actually think I like the thought of not having just a gradient in color, but a gradient in value. So by pulling off a little bit of the sky, and as I go down, I'm going to just pull off more until the paper towel becomes full and it fades. I'll wipe a little bit of this on. I just want to create a fairly smooth gradient of slightly darker to the left to slightly lighter to the right, just to imply that the sky is just a little darker on this side. I kind of like that idea, even though it's not in the sketch. See if that works. And again, I think as I mentioned, I left this little thing poking up here because there's going to be a tree breaking that edge. Yeah, I do like that. I think I do like that gradient. It just needs to be a little smoother. A little smoother. Okay. All right. Well, what values do I need now? Let's do the snow. The snow is so important, and I'm going to mix all. I think what I'll do is that snow compared to the value of the trees back here. The darkest of the snow is so close to this value in the trees. I think I'll leave that and maybe even push that a little bit more than what I'm seeing. I'll have to decide. What I will start to do is mix the light of the snow. Now I can see on the value scale it's almost exactly a 50% gray. It's a little bit lighter than a 50% gray. So in terms of this value scale, I'm going to be looking for something about toward the upper end here. I'm going to need a lot more paint because it's taking a large part of the canvas. Mix a touch of oil with it. Do be careful if you eliminate solvents and use oil to thin your paints. Do be careful that you don't put too much oil on the bottom layers of your painting, doing an underpainting such as this. if you end up with layers with more oil on the bottom than are on the top, the paint film will crack, and you'll have problems with drying. It's the lean over fat, or fat over lean principle. You want lean on the bottom layers, that is very little fat, and fat layers on the top. Occasionally, I'll use an alkyd as underpainting pigments, both the white and the sienna and burnt umber as an alkyd, because alkyd by its very nature is very lean. And alkyds, for what it's worth, I think it was on Gamblin's website, I was reading that alkyds are great for underpaintings, and you can certainly use alkyd on top of alkyd for the entire painting, but you do not want to start the painting with traditional oils and finish with the alkyds, because the alkyds are lean, and it can lead to the paint film cracking, which I did not know. So it's lucky, I guess, for me that I tended to use the alkyds only for the underpainting. Okay, I'm going to use a fairly large brush with this. Just a mental note to make. I'm a big advocate of using the largest brush I possibly can, especially in the early stages of a painting, because it keeps you from getting fussy. It'll keep you from getting too tied up into little details. And in fact, I still have some brush marks up in here that I would like to get rid of. So I'm just going to use a larger brush to make that a little more of a smooth gradient, getting rid of it. Okay, getting rid of those brush strokes. So I have the color for the snow. As I mentioned, I'm going to use the largest brush I can. Keeps you from getting fussy with details. And starting, sadly, I've actually seen people, I've in the course of a workshop asked people to do an underpainting, and they'll have a large area on their canvas and literally using a brush like this to start to brush in the paint. And I tell them that the workshop only lasts a week, and it's going to take them that long to do one little area here at that rate. So please, you become accustomed to using large brushes. It not only will speed your work, but by using them, you'll improve your drawing skills, because it takes a little more precision to work with a large brush, but it's also more freeing. You may end up seeing your brushwork be a little looser and a little more free. So this paint, okay, you can see what a difference that makes now, right? It looks almost as if this is the same value as the sky, but I think you'll see that, wait a minute, it is the same value as the sky. Oh, that's right, the values of the sky are very close to this. That's interesting, because I don't know if I want this to be the same value as the sky. Do I lighten the sky up, or do I darken this? I think I'm going to darken this a little bit. So let me go back. Well, I'm glad I caught that, because I don't want that to be the same darkness as the sky. The same value as the sky. Darken this up just a little bit, so this needs to be, well, that's about it. I maybe darken it just a touch. And that is probably going to be closer. It does not have to be much lighter than the sky, but if it's the same value, that can create some problems a little bit later on, especially with these incredible darks. If this is the same value as the sky, this might end up even looking lighter than the sky, just because it's going to be surrounded by lights, or darks. So let's put this, there we go. That's going to be a little easier. So I'm just going to scumble this, fill this in very quickly, large brush. I would fill it in with the paper towel, but the paper towel might just pick up so much paint as to make it, and I don't want to use quite that much paint filling up a paper towel. Okay, now I will switch to a smaller brush, and I'm going to darken this just a little bit more, because I want to capture that gradient. I started with more of the light of the snow, and I want to work towards the dark of the snow. I have 3 values of the snow right now, so I'm just going to work from light and the dark and then come into the middle. I need to switch brushes, because now I'm going to work in an area of the painting that is much smaller, smaller shapes. A reason that at least I try to keep the paint film thin here is that as I start to work the lights in, I want to drag a little bit of this dark from the bushes into the snow, just to create more of help me create the gradient and create some shadow effects and things like that. If I have a lot of paint on the canvas, I'm just trying to manipulate too much paint, and really losing the opportunity to let sometimes the canvas just show through. So it's, for me at least, it's another advantage of keeping that paint film thin. At least I think I will start the darks with maybe just a little bit of the dark up here. Now in my sketch, you may remember in the sketch, you'll notice that there is a little path coming through the foreground snow. I think at some point on the underpainting, I'm going to want to work that. I'm going to need to include that because it's such an important part, I think, of the composition and the way the painting, leading the eye into the painting. So that's important, and I'll include that. For right now, I'm just going to work just a little bit of the snow, work this dark into the snow to create a gradient, and then I'll come back in with the lighter paint perhaps, and working the darker paint and paint that path in. So this paint, this paint I'm putting on is really exactly the same value as the tone, which is fine because now with my brush not loaded with the paint, but with enough paint in here, I'm going to start to shape these hills, keeping the lines soft and letting my brush pick up paint, which will then darken the snow a little bit and create that gradient for me. Bringing that paint in here, there's a little bit of a faint shadow here. I think I'm getting just a hint of the field there. Looking now, referring to my sketch, which is just to my right, I can see that I've got this field comes in here. Maybe I have. Notice now how I am picking up paint with the brush so that this snow is actually getting darker as I'm working upward toward the background, which is exactly where I want that gradient to go. So rather than having to mix every transitional value, I'm just essentially letting the paint blend a little bit and create that difference for me. Dark up in here. Keeping the edges soft. And the snow goes up in here a little bit and gets a little darker. We step back and see that I'm getting a nice transition. Okay, yeah, I think you can see it's subtle, but there's certainly a transition in value from here to here to here. That's that gradient. That's the gradient that I need to create the illusion that this is going back in space. What will also help, of course, to make the marks smaller and just keeping the edges softer in some of in the background will also help create that illusion. Now the snow, as it gets on this hill, now that was too dark. I picked up some of the dark and transferred it right to where I really need this. When I get to the snow on the back of this hill, because it's going to be right next to the lightest lights, I don't want to have it this dark. And in fact, I think even in the photograph, you can see that there is a noticeable difference in value between the snow on this field that's in shadow and the snow that's in shadow at the base of the hill right next to the lightest lights. So I'm not going to change this. And in fact, that might be already the exact value that I need. Instead, I think I'll come in. I do need. I think it could stand to have be a little bit darker, in not the snow, but in some of these passages. I seem to have gotten a little too much oil on this, so it's letting too much of the underpainting or the tone canvas show through. And notice how it's getting picked up now by my fingers. So that usually tells me that I have too much oil. If it's a real problem, and it's causing me a lot of problems, I'll often just take a paper towel and just press it against the area, and it will essentially blot out some of that oil and allow me then to go back in with with unoiled paint, unthinned paint, and reestablish some of those darks. It's you know, minor issue at this point. This tree actually, notice I think both in my sketch and the photo, how this tree really seems to stand out a little more darker against the snow than some of the bushes do in here, because they're picking up some of the ambient light from the sky, whereas that is in shadow. I like that difference, the fact that this is a little bit darker than what's going on over here. And then by the same token, this could probably get a little bit darker too. Even though I've maybe lost that gradient in this area from dark to dark light here, because I've just darkened this, I think for the painting itself, for the whole painting, I think it's actually a nicer little change. And I can always come in with at some point with a really strong dark and hit some of these foreground areas just to make sure that there still is some bit of a transition. Okay, I'm looking at this right now. This is jumping out at me, this shape echoing that shape. I want to make these a little bit different. So I'll just drag some of the dark paint in. I just want to break that up a little bit. Maybe there's a mid-ground bush here. Something happening there. I'll going back now to the snow. There's an awful lot of detail in this field, where the snow is visible between bushes, and there are slight breaks in the foliage. And you know, how important is that to indicate at this point? I don't think that important. What I need to do are get the major shapes correct. And that means making sure that some of these shapes aren't identical and they're not the same size, and that there's enough variety and interest among them. That's okay. I just maybe need to bring a little of that in here. Yeah, again, I've lost my dark. This is all getting a little oily. I'm going to continue to work both with the light snow and the darks, just trying to make these shapes different and interesting, and following now some of the patterns I'm seeing in the photograph of where these shapes are just broken up in subtle little ways and form nice little, just the pattern, just how that pattern of those dark bushes is working. Now, the path that I have in the sketch, looking at the sketch, the way the path winds, I think I can probably do that without having to refer to it, other than just over my shoulder briefly. But it breaks in here and then comes out at the bottom there. And this, of course, was totally invented. It was not, as you can see, it's not in the photo. At one point in the middle of the photo, when I was painting in the snow and trying to cover the snow, I played a little bit with the idea of the path coming in, and I realized then that I liked it. And I just wanted a little something simple to get the eye through the foreground and into the middle ground. Okay, let's step back, looking at these shapes. Yeah, okay. I feel a little bit better about where this is going. I think that it could probably use, as I have both in the sketch and as I see in the photo, this is a little messy in here, and that there are too many little value variations. I think I want to keep that as more of a flat value shape, and you know, maybe an indication of just a couple details there. Now, before I go much further, I need to put the white in the snow in, because that's the lightest light, and that's going to, I just know from experience that that's going to make all the other values come together. What looks like a very light value here or in the sky is going to suddenly be pushed back and will appear darker just by lighting the sky. Before I do that, I have a lot of brushwork that's catching reflections in the snow. I don't know if it's going to be visible in the video, but I find it a little bothersome, so I'm just going to soften that just a little bit. Let's see. Let's go with the light of the sky, and then this is probably going to have to lighten up just a little bit. In my photograph, the values of that, it's just lighter than 50%, and you can see that's still darker than that. And in fact, even the sky still looks a little dark to me. I'm gonna just double check the sky. I'm gonna taking a little bit of the paint. Yeah, the sky right now is that dark. That is too dark. I'm gonna lighten that up and repaint the sky before I do the snow. Because if I don't do that, I think what's going to happen is that the snow is going to be too light, and I'm going to end up with a painting that's actually a little bit darker than I wanted.
Hey, would you like to win a beautiful painting worth almost $3,000? We've got a beautiful Joe McGurl plein air study that he's done of the sunset in Maine. It's gorgeous. If you want to have an opportunity to win it, go to paintinggiveaway.com. Just put in your email. That's all you've got to do, and you only need to enter once. We'll be giving away the prize at the end of May. Go to paintinggiveaway.com.
John MacDonald's paintings draw people into the scene. His paintings make the viewer feel the scene, the warmth of the sun on their skin or the cold snow crunching beneath their feet. In Poetic Landscapes with John MacDonald, you'll discover how John paints emotion into his landscapes, how he uses color, value relationships, and the quality of light to capture a certain mood. You'll soon understand how John uses composition, a focal point, and tonal paint to guide the viewer into his paintings and into a feeling or an experience.
So what is a painting? A painting is a construction. It has parts, components, and a process. Different artists have different lists of what the parts of a painting is, but most 4, 5, 6 items, most agree on the essentials. And they are composition, values, or more specifically a value structure, colors, more specifically color relationships, edge contrasts, and details. Those are what I see as the 5 components of a painting. But what's crucial to understand is that these are not all equal. There is a hierarchy.
Artists are often taught that painting from a photo will never work, that it's impossible to capture the amazing beauty of nature from a flat picture, which could distort color, condense values, and make it hard to distinguish shapes and shadows. And a camera absolutely cannot record the excitement you feel when visiting a scenic landscape. But many landscape artists would like to be able to paint in the studio from photos.
The point of using photographs is not to find one photograph you can copy, but a variety of photos that all give you visual information, and hopefully one photograph that can capture enough of the value relationships that you can use that as information regarding the values and the details. As I mentioned, that being, I think, the best advantage of using a photo.
John will show you how to have the best of both worlds, to enjoy nature while you're there, and to set yourself up to later capture that beauty on canvas in such a way that as you paint, you'll feel like you're right back there, enjoying every moment and taking in everything nature offered you. And whether or not you paint fully on location or also paint in the studio, soon you'll be creating more dynamic paintings that draw the viewer's eye in to feel the emotion that you've painted. Poetic Landscapes is available on DVD or digitally for your computer, tablet, or smartphone. Order yours today and start adding captivating emotions to your paintings.
There is so much depth behind John MacDonald and his process. There's so much to learn. This video was called Poetic Landscapes, and you can learn more about it at lilyartvideo.com. Now, let's learn more about John. Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air magazines. And today we have John MacDonald with us. John, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So you and I first met in the Adirondack Mountains, I believe.
We did at your event, I think 4 or 5 years ago.
So what I thought was really fascinating is I didn't know about you. You know, people have, there are regional stars, if you will, and you live in the Berkshires, and you're well known in the East, in the region, but I wasn't aware of you because I don't live in the Berkshires. I live in the Adirondacks in the summer. But what I found fascinating is that people were kind of globbing onto you and watching you paint and wanting to learn how you paint. And that's when I gained a lot of respect for you as a painter, when I first saw your paintings. And you know, we bring them in at night and everybody's looking at everybody's paintings, and yours were standing out above the crowd. So one of the reasons you're here is because of that opportunity when we met at the Publishers Invitational in the Adirondacks.
Such a great event. Yeah, terrific event.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, isn't it?
It is. It is. And I've spoken to so many artists. I think what we like about that is the feeling of camaraderie, the lack of a hierarchy, where you can just go and paint, rub shoulders with beginners, with masters, and just pick up on everybody's energy, and being reminded constantly by the most raw recruits to the art, the very beginning painters, of the important questions to ask. I invariably come back from the Adirondacks having learned something that I learned from a very beginner painter. Sometimes it's just an attitude, you know, so it's good. It's a great event, yeah.
So last year, I was driving to Boston, and I decided to stop at your studio. And we did a little video of a studio visit. Yeah. But what I was fascinated with was your process, which you'll be talking about, I'm sure. But you have used technology to aid your process. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, it came out of a stretch of maybe 15 years when my wife and I, our first of two sons, was born, and I realized that financially I wanted to just contribute a little more to the family's income. So I went back to what I'd always been doing on the side as a freelance illustrator. And at the time I was using scratchboard, a black and white medium, using a sharp tool to scratch away ink on a white surface. And I absolutely loved it. It was like an etching. It could be like a woodcut. But more and more of my clients asked for color. And it's a nightmare to color because if you use watercolor dyes, it soaks into the ground of the scratchboard and looks awful. So I finally realized it was time to get a computer, and I started coloring the work in Photoshop. So over the course of 10, 12 years, I got very skilled in using Photoshop in a very narrow range of all that the program offers, but mainly about manipulating images. So that then around the 2000s, as I started to phase out my career as an illustrator and wanted to get back full-time as a painter, I realized I could use those skills to manipulate photographs. So that is, I would take a photograph, and in the old days, whether I printed it or it was on my monitor, I might grab my sketchbook and do 2 or 3 little thumbnails of different ways to crop it, different ways to apply the major values of the shapes, to establish the value structure of the painting with a pencil. I found that I could do a lot of that in Photoshop much more quickly, which allowed a lot more for me, creative freedom. I could try 15 different croppings in the time it would take me to do 2 with the pencil. And it made me aware of just the power of the program. So although I still do quite a bit of plein air painting as much as I can for a variety of reasons, not the least of which it's just great training. It teaches you exactly what the camera cannot capture. But I do a lot of plein air, but almost all my larger work now in the studio, I use photographs, sketches, and when I can, a plein air color study done on location.
So there are some people who might scold you for using photographs, because there are some purists who believe that everything should be done from life, that everything is going to be distorted because of a photograph. Is it that you've trained yourself to understand what nature is going to do because you were plein air painting, so that when you do paint from a photo, you can get that sense of life?
Yes, I can understand that attitude because I was there in the early 2000s. When I was still doing some illustration, I spent maybe 3 years painting solely outdoors. I would do no painting in the studio. That was where I did illustration, and I wanted to keep them separate. So I spent 3 years, and if I didn't finish a painting, I'd have to wait till the weather conditions were approximately the same to go back out on location and work on that painting. I think that yes, you need plein air. Any landscape painter has to paint plein air, go through at least a phase of painting plein air. If not, and if you rely solely on photographs, I think that can show in the photo. Where a photograph, though, is a kiss of death for an artist is if the focus is outward and you are simply copying the photograph. So what I use photographs for often in Photoshop is I am not looking to create an ideal photograph that then I simply copy. That of one single image that I look at and say, this will make a great painting if I copy it exactly. That would still look like a copied photograph. What I'm always aiming at is to create a photo, and I will alter both the cropping, but I will also alter the values of the image and the values in the color as well. I'm trying to recreate that scene as I remembered it. Including the way I felt about it. So for me, it's the feelings of an artist on location. That's one of the great advantages of being plein air. You're not just seeing something, you're in that scene. You're living in that landscape. You're as much an integral part of that landscape as a tree or a cloud that you're painting. I think that has a great power on the psyche and the soul of an artist that can come out in the painting. But if I simply run out to a landscape, take a photograph, and go back to the studio and copy it, that photograph is a soulless mechanical reproduction of what the lens sees, not even what the human eye sees. And then you end up copying a soulless reproduction of just an image. The camera cannot record your emotions, the artist's emotions, the artist's feelings. What attracted you to this scene in the first place? Often it has much more to do than just a simple color relationship or the story of an old tractor in the field. There is an emotional connection to the landscape that exists when we're plein air that cannot exist in the studio if all you do is rely on a photograph. So I have my foot in both camps. I understand perfectly why there are some who say you cannot copy from photographs. And that is true, but I think you can use photographs simply for visual reference, as visual raw material, information, that you can use then to recreate the memories and the feelings that you felt when you were on location.
Well, that's something that it's very hard to articulate. So when you go out in plein air and you're walking through the woods and you find a spot that speaks to you, you're like, there's something about this that you're having an emotional connection to. How do you translate that into a painting?
Because there are no tubes that say drama. There's not a tube that says tranquility. There's not a tube that says peace. Exactly. It's all, well, there's the skill component of that. We have to know as artists how to compose a painting, how to manipulate value relationships that create one mood as opposed to another. How a soft edge can actually create an emotional tone to a painting that all hard edges won't. I think that's part of both learning skills as an artist, but being mindfully aware that as an artist, as a human being, I'm responding to this with emotion and with all the experience in my story and my history, and that can influence the way I want to paint. Ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, why are we doing this? Is it just to produce pictures, or is it a way to, for me, it's always been a way of connecting to the landscape. I've often said that for me, painting plein air is really a form of meditation. If I didn't know how to paint, I could still be very happy sitting in a meadow for 2 hours and just watching what happens. It's a miracle. You know, everything is miraculous out there. And just enjoy the color relationships without painting. The painting is actually, for me, an important part of that meditative process because it stills my mind and gives me, it's like a chew toy for the mind. You know, the discursive mind that's always talking. When I paint on location, there is a part of my mind that just shuts down and is very still and is so intently focused on looking at these color relationships and recording them and mixing them. For me, a painting is an excuse for a way to more deeply experience a landscape than I ever could. It stills the mind, it makes me focus on relationships, color-light relationships, and try to capture a mood in paint. So, which goes back to using photos. I think that if you're in a landscape and you just simply take one photo and rush back to the studio, it's going to be very hard to capture any kind of a mood or a feeling in that painting that you experience because you weren't there long enough to experience a mood. Yeah. I think it's important, even if you use photographs, to spend as much time in the landscape as possible. Quality time matters. So take 30 photographs, different exposures, then sit and do a couple sketches, and if you can't, do a plein air color study. No intention to do a finished painting. You don't have to put that pressure on you. But it not only doing a plein air color study will not only give you a much more accurate record of the color relationships in the landscape than a camera ever could. It's also in another 2 hours spent in that landscape, living it, experiencing it. I know that Whistler, they said that Whistler was a huge advocate of painting from memory because he felt that was the essence of the landscape, is what we remembered, because we would only remember the most important things, what that landscape meant to us. So I think that's absolutely true. To go out into a landscape and experiencing it is going to affect you in a way that can come out in your paintings in a way that will not happen if you just rush out, take one photograph, and then go home and paint it in the studio. If that makes sense. It
makes a lot of sense, and I've heard a couple of different philosophies on that. One philosophy is get out, find the spot that you respond to, set up your gear, and then don't put yourself under any pressure. Just sit there, enjoy it, look around, take in the birds and the sounds and the breeze on your face and the movement, and just actually take it all in and kind of get into kind of a meditative process. The painters in Russia that I've met and painted with, most of them are Orthodox, and they actually use painting as a form of prayer. They put themselves into a meditative state. But I've also heard some people say that the minute that you get there, get the part that you're excited about down on the canvas first. So if maybe it's the bark on a particular tree, don't try to execute the entire painting, but focus on getting that one piece first, because we get tired, we get fatigued, and so at least if you get that, you've got the primary thing.
I absolutely agree with that. And in fact, even when I don't have the time for a plein air study, but I'm on location and I know I have enough time to take photos, and I love to spend at least a half an hour on location to soak it in. That's so important to do that. I will almost always, even with camera in my hand, if I don't have my painting gear, ask myself, what is it about this scene that really is touching me? What is it that I'm so interested in? I have to identify that, because that is the message of the painting when I go back home. And I can't lose sight of that, whether or not it's the actual focal point, and often it is, but it's also just the message of the painting. For instance, I'm not a subject painter. That is, when I go out, I know a lot of painters love to paint an old barn or a tractor, or even in a city they might paint cafes or rundown factories. There's a narrative quality. They're telling a story in some ways, and that's a perfectly valid way of painting. Artists have done that for ages. I tend to be more of a formalist. When I'm in the landscape, I'm not concerned with a narrative that, oh, here's a farm, or here's an old tractor and the demise of agriculture. I'm much more interested in formal relationships, a mood, the atmosphere created by dramatic lighting or certain color or value relationships. So for me, I think it's especially important when I go out to ask myself, what exactly is it in this scene that I'm attracted to, that I feel such a pull towards wanting to put into paint? Often it's a quality of light. More often than not, I think as the years go by, it's a mood. I think at heart I am a tonalist. The American tonalist being, a varied group, but George Inness, I think, was considered one of the premier founders of the group, and he was a deeply spiritual person. For him, painting the landscape was a way of prayer and a spiritual, a lesson in his spirituality and his came out of his spiritual philosophy. So for me, that mood or atmosphere is a little more ambiguous than trying to capture, a certain tractor or something that's more geared towards subject matter.
Well, I think for some of the people who might be viewing this, maybe you could get into a little depth about what tonalism really is. I think that being a tonalist is one of the most difficult things a painter can do, because you're interpreting everything differently, right? you're out there seeing bright colored grass, but you're not making it bright colored. You're
Right.
making everything within a range of tone.
The philosophy, and I wish I knew more about it than I do, but the philosophy is extremely varied. The artists that were clumped in with a tonalist shared some similarities, one of which they like to unify the painting, typically with one tone that they often painted at a warm key. They used glazes and scumbling. They weren't interested, as the Impressionists were interested in the actual optics of the eye and the physics of the eye. They were much more interested in how a landscape felt, an emotional connection, whether it was spiritual or not. It had often much to do with an emotional connection to the landscape, and they love to capture the ephemeral moments of a landscape, which is why you rarely ever see a tonalist painting done at full noon under a blazing sun. They were much more likely to be a dusk or dawn scene with very few elements, hiding a lot of form. So much of it had to do with mood, capturing a certain mood, a certain time of the morning or afternoon when forms dissolved into a mist or a light. Very different work from the Impressionists.
Of course, most photographers and most painters will tell you that the golden light is the best light, which is typically the early morning light and the late afternoon light. But there are moments of golden light that last only a few seconds.
That's right.
That are sometimes the best golden light, oftentimes at a sunset. So how does one capture those moments of golden light? Is it about memory training? Because you literally have sometimes
20 seconds, a minute,
yeah.
It can pass so quickly. I know that the memory training was a huge component of a lot of the French schools in the late 1800s. A lot of the tonalists studied both either in Munich or in Paris, where that kind of training was important and promulgated by the instructors. So I think that was an important part of it too. I think a lot of it was just living in the landscape. A lot of the tonalists painted plein air, but a lot of them created their larger paintings in the studio from memory, deliberately. They wanted the memory to influence how they saw things. So in a 5 minutes, you have 5 minutes of a sunset. I think it's fun to try and slapdash that down in a plein air painting. Often you're really limited to just color mixtures, which I think is perfectly appropriate. Why not? Because the camera can't capture. A quick sketch, I do think that's where a camera sometimes can come in very handy, capturing those ephemeral moments, even though you have to understand that it's not going to capture the color, and it often exaggerates the value contrast. But at least it captures detail and form that then you can take a couple quick shots and then sit down with your sketchbook and make color notes, anything you can do to put that in your head so you can go back into the studio and paint it. I know with George Inness, especially later in his life, all his paintings were creations. He just pulled them out of his head. He had spent so much time painting plein air and studying nature that he was able to do that toward the end of his life. They were all inventions.
So if your intent was to do a sunset painting, for instance, in plein air, would you go in and lay out kind of the basic drawing elements and so on, and then wait till that 5 minute period of time to put your color in?
Well, I can remember clearly 3 years ago or 4 in the Adirondacks, sitting on the beach near Paul Smith's with a group, spectacular sunset, and I think I did maybe 4 or 5 paintings in 45 minutes, not one of which, of course, would end up in a gallery. They weren't finished paintings. It was the experience and fun, but I think that the advantage of that is you don't have time to fuss. You take a large brush, you block in the color and values as quickly as you can and as accurately as you can, and it's a little bit like downhill skiing on a 3-diamond trail when you're really trained to be on the bunny slopes. It is an exhilarating and terrifying time to paint, but it's a lot of fun, and sometimes that's the only way you can capture it. I do think doing that, it's going to burn it into your memory, and coupled with those sketches and coupled with maybe a couple good photographs can lead to a successful painting in the studio.
Yeah, well, the problem, of course, with photographs is that when you're photographing a sunset, you can never get it right, because photographs, typically cameras average out the entire scene, which means the sky is different from the foreground.
That's right.
And so you can manipulate a photograph, but it's never as accurate or brilliant as what you see.
Never.
As a matter of fact, the Hudson River School painters were criticized for their bright Adirondack sunsets because nobody believed that could actually be true. They thought they had exaggerated them, and if anything, they were probably under-exaggerated.
That's right. They were accurate. They were accurate. Yeah, interesting.
It's just so colorful.
Yeah.
So let's go back just a step. Tell me about early days, interest in art. What got you excited about becoming an artist, becoming an illustrator?
I think like so many artists, I always drew. You know, I was the kid whose margins of my books in grade school, frankly, I wish I'd kept some of them. I would draw scenes from Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, if you remember that old, one of my favorite programs. So there were little submarines, and I went through all those phases. Into high school, I got more serious. I was actually taking art classes at our local, they called it the Lafayette Museum of Art in Lafayette, Indiana. Figure drawing classes in high school, and would often spend in the summer, do pen and ink drawings, set up a still life in our living room of a little flowers and do drawings. I knew it by the time I was in high school that I was terrible at math and I loved art. And it seemed a natural then to study art. My parents were very supportive. I was so fortunate for that. Although my father did both of them made the stipulation that I go to a university and get a rounded, more liberal arts education than just art. I could major in art, but they wanted me to be a little more rounded. I'm of both minds of that today. I have friends who left high school and studied in Florence for 2 years, and boy, that sounds like a great way to jump into the art world. I have really no regrets. And then I went to graduate school in painting and drawing, studied etching in France for 7 months, which was wonderful. Decided at the end that I didn't want to be a printmaker because the process took so much time that all the ideas were backing up, but it was all good experience.
Well, let me just stop you right there, because you said two things I want to know more about. You studied printmaking in France. I want to know more about that. And you also talked before that about the school, but you didn't mention where you went.
Oh, I went to Washington University in St. Louis.
Okay.
They had a very strong, I'll start with that maybe. They had a very strong art program. They had a very successful illustration program. At the time, they'd produced 2 or 3 of the real top names of Bernie Fuchs and of course, I'm totally blank. Even Mike Peters, the political cartoonist, who's quite well known, came out of WashU's illustration program. At the time, and nothing against them, because there's a lot of abstract work I love, but the painting faculty were entirely abstract expressionists. I wanted to learn how to paint light and form, and that wasn't their thing. So I ended up studying illustration, because the illustration instructors, that's what it was all about. They would teach you how to do a portrait and how to do a still life and how to do a landscape. So I was a illustration major. And then following college, went to France. I love the etching. I love the graphic quality of the black and white work. But I was taught in a school that was very traditional, where we bought the copper plates and we spent a day polishing the plate. And then you would mix the wax, the varnishes. And I found that I was, meanwhile, walking the streets of Avignon with a sketchbook, coming upon scene after scene that I wanted to translate into an etching. But the process, it took me a week to do one etching. And by that time, I had 10 sketches I wanted to do. And by the second week, I had 30 sketches. I realized I was never going to catch up with this. So it was just a lesson that at that point, I realized the process was so time-consuming. It was just not for me.
So was there an etching school that you attended?
It was a professional, a woman who ran her own atelier, and she would do work, take outside assignments to do work, and produce her own work, and she just took on students. It was very small, but a wonderful experience. But then I came back and went back to grad school for drawing and painting. I always had known that at that time I was still painting, but starting as a freelance illustrator. And I knew that I wanted my foot in both. And as my illustration career took off and it became fairly successful, I was actually able to help send our boys to college with it. I realized that illustration paid the bills, but painting fed the soul. And I needed both. At that time in my life, I needed both. I felt too that the illustration, I had friends who were painters who were unable to support themselves, so they waited tables. I decided that I would rather spend that time drawing as an illustrator. That would increase my drawing skills. So looking back, I have no regrets of the portion of my life I've spent as an illustrator. For that very reason, it really fine-tuned my drawing skills, which I think now have come to help with my painting.
Well, the illustration business completely changed right about the time you were kind of winding down that part of your career and moving more into painting.
I was so fortunate.
Tell me about
the timing was
that.
perfect. I remember, well, I remember at one point in the early 2000s, maybe it was the late 1990s, I was so busy that within 1 week I turned down a job from the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. News and World Report, and I think the Los Angeles Times, and I knew at that moment I'd made it. That if I could afford to turn, some fairly big clients down, and they were fine with it because they knew I was busy. So at that point I was working and frankly doing very little painting. I was just so busy. I had 5 or 6 jobs a week. I was working 6 days a week. I would take Sundays off, and often working 12 or 14-hour days. I knew I had to pay my dues, and I think that went on for 2 years until my wife had a talk with me. And then we started taking the weekends off together, which was great. But I think it was in the mid-2000s that my heart wasn't in it anymore. The industry had changed quite a bit. Deadlines became tighter. The pay continued to drop. And it just didn't feel the same. And I think that by that time, too, I was probably in my late 40s, I guess it would have been late 40s. I was looking forward to just painting again and really getting back into painting in a very serious way. In 2008, when the market crashed there, what few illustration jobs I had completely disappeared. So I was very fortunate. I was ready to get out of illustration just at the time that the industry suffered a severe setback in 2008. Magazines, I think within 1 year, 5 of my magazine clients went out of business. Newspapers could no longer afford my prices for illustrations, so the phone stopped ringing. And I was fortunately in a position that I was able to just transition right into painting full time. Of course, that meant getting my painting skills up to snuff. And I look back at my work that I was doing 15 years ago and was astonished how poor it looks by today. But
so what does that process look like? You make a conscious decision that you're going to become a full-time painter. Now you've got a whole different set of pressures, because you not only have to get your painting up to snuff, you have to get your paintings out there, you have to get into the market, so to speak.
That's right.
What was that process like for you of getting your paintings up to snuff and then getting them to the point where you could make a living?
Well, I think that both of those cases were addressed by what I learned as an illustrator. When I first started in illustration, I produced what I thought were my best 8 pieces of work, all different media, all different subjects, and at great expense I sent out 400 pieces to art directors, and I got absolutely 0 responses. So I thought, I'm not doing this right. So I went to Barnes & Noble and I bought a book that just happened to be out, Marketing and Business Skills for Illustrators, and absolutely devoured it. And 4 months later, I had identified my style that I wanted. I identified the market I wanted to advertise to, and within 6 months, I was busy. So I learned the lesson that you have to market, that it's not going to happen accidentally. I think a lot of when I was young, thought, no, let the quality of my work speak for itself. That's true. The quality speaks at a certain level, but there are a lot of beautifully talented artists who are still, having to struggle to put food on the table. You have to market. So I learned that from illustration. In terms of getting my skills up to snuff, I think it was the work ethic from illustration that it just became very normal for me to go into the studio at 7 in the morning and leave at 5 o'clock at night and just work and work.
You have to treat it like a job.
It is, and it was a job, but it didn't feel like a job because
because you love doing it.
I loved it. Yeah.
But I think this is one of the problems that a lot of painters struggle with, is that they're trying to get their careers on fire, they're trying to launch their careers, but they're not spending any time in marketing, which is why we're doing a lot of marketing training.
That's right.
But they're also easily distracted. What I tell them is, look, you've got to go in there. If you moved from your full-time job as a dental hygienist or a doctor or a lawyer or whatever you were doing, you have to take that same amount of time, or probably more, and get in there and be disciplined and apply it to your work.
That's
get
right.
in there. Don't mess around in the morning. Just get to work and work all day.
That's huge. And I know you'd agree with this. Eric Maisel, who's the founder of Creativity Coaching and has put out some wonderful books for artists, he once said something that I know you have often alluded to in the talks, and I listened to your art marketing boot camp. If anything that supports your work is part of your work. So marketing can be such an important part of your career as a painter that it is as important as painting. Because without the marketing, there are going to be no galleries, no sales, and then you may not be able to afford to paint. So anything that supports your work is part of your work. It's part of the job.
Well, you know, it's kind of like it's the gas to the car.
That's right. That's right.
You absolutely
That's a good analogy.
have
Yeah,
that.
it really is. So I think for me, when I was starting, I thought, well, if it worked as an illustrator to buy a book, at that time I bought a book about marketing for artists. And what was it, The Artist's Guide to Galleries? Or they used to, those big thick books that used to come out in the late 90s. I bought one of those and approached some galleries. You learn very quickly that, and I think, again, because of the illustration, knowing that I needed to have a work that was identifiably me, and that I needed to identify that market. So I quickly learned, too, what galleries may accept my work and what wouldn't. I didn't bother approaching a gallery that was full of abstract expressionists. I was looking for someone that sold landscapes, but maybe not having too many artists that, you know, of similar work, et cetera, et cetera. So I was, even though I didn't like it, and I've never liked marketing, it's just, you know, I think most artists don't, but I realized this is something I have to do. It's an important part of the work. And in terms of getting into the studio, you just have to paint. You have to paint. And I think, though, that what I used to do as an illustrator that I found so helpful is every 6 months and I'd never let a year go by without doing this. I would pull out my 10 most successful illustrations and I would lay them on the floor. And I would look at them for probably an hour and make a list of what I thought really worked in each one, found out what they had in common, and then I thought, well, if by focusing on such and such, the composition or the way I position things or the way I'm handling the color, if that's leading to all these successful illustrations, why don't I do that in all my work? And then I would do the next day I would do the opposite. I'd pull out my 10, what I considered my worst pieces, and I'd say, what do these have in common that is killing them? And then I'd try to avoid that. And I carried that over a little bit in my paintings. So I think that when I was beginning 15 years ago and really struggling, I was struggling with the materials, struggling with the concepts, but I was hoping I could get to the point where I could paint the way I had always wanted to and express what I wanted to express. I went through the same process. I think also being an illustrator taught me to separate my ego from the work. I can't tell you the number of times I would do an illustration and I'd send it off to the client, skipping with joy, knowing I was going to get a call in 20 minutes from the art director saying, wow, you nailed it. This is a home run. We love it. And instead they would say, we don't like it. The client doesn't like it. You need to change this, this, and this. And, you know, I could hear the air of the balloon of my ego going, shh, you know. And then there were times when I would do a piece, tight deadline. I had to make the deadline, and I was ashamed of it. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm never going to hear from this client again. And they would call and they say, oh, we love it. The client loves it. We want you to do 15 more just like this. So I learned quickly that I can't really judge my own work. And if you let your ego get attached to work, you'll never learn from your mistakes, your failures.
I think that's a really critical point for everybody. It's an aha moment, really, because we're all too close to it.
Absolutely.
I visited a gallery that I'm in, and they had an old painting that I had painted 10 years earlier, and it was hanging up there. It hadn't sold. And there was this woman who was a collector who kind of spends a lot of time at that gallery. And I was cringing when I walked up the stairs and I saw this painting. I was cringing. It's like, oh, I hate that painting. And I was about ready to say something about it because I was almost apologetic, right? I was about ready to say something, and this woman says to me, you know, this is my favorite painting of yours that I've ever done, and I'm just saving my money so that I can own this piece.
Yeah.
And I was about to go, you know, what a horrible painting.
Yeah.
And so I think that the problem is that we can't see our own work. So how do you know when you're good? How do you know when a painting is good? So you're trying to elevate your work, and you can't see it yourself. You can't always see what works, especially in the beginning when you don't have sales, when you haven't had a gallery. Is there a tool, a way to find out? Is it going to other people to get insights? How did you do it?
Let me first go back to because you said you don't know if you're good or the painting is good. And let me just quickly separate these two. I don't think it's helpful to worry about whether other artists think I'm good or the world, frankly, because I can't judge. I don't know. So I also think then that ultimately, it's not that that's unimportant, but ultimately that leads too often, if I'm thinking that, oh my gosh, I'm not good measured against all other artists, that puts a lot of pressure on yourself. It's going to trigger the negative, that judge in our mind that just loves to trash us. You should have gone to business school. You never should have tried to be an art major. That's not helpful. But to know whether this or not, this specific painting is good or not can be very helpful information. I think as I look back, I wouldn't call it a mistake. I would probably change it if I could go back, but I, for some reason, just always felt like I needed to figure this out myself. So between grad school and say where I am, certainly where I am now, I've taken very few I've taken workshops, but very few. I don't know, felt like it wasn't that I didn't need to go to other artists as much as it just never occurred to me that I could ask for help. I have felt that I have to figure this out. So for me, I often would compare my work to the masters, Monet's, the Inneses, the Sargents, and say, well, I can see clearly that I don't have the brushwork of Sargent, I don't understand the color like Monet, and I don't understand composition or value like Innes. So I would just study them, and then go out and just keep painting. And always comparing a successful painting of mine to an unsuccessful, and trying to learn, again, what did I do here that worked, and again, comparing it with other artists. Then later, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I started to really pay attention to what other artists were doing. I had always, up to that point, focused really on the great old masters. And I would often run into art magazines, a plein air magazine, and I would be attracted to, wow, that's a killer painting, or, well, I don't know about that painting. I never bothered to follow specific artists. I never really paid much attention to what was going on in this country today in plein air painting, landscape painting. That dramatically changed everything, and it has been so helpful. Connecting with other artists, I now have I've become friends with just some terrific artists who have no compunction at all about saying, that sky's not working in that painting. I love that kind of criticism because I know from who it's coming from, they know exactly what's not working and they can help me see it. So I think that, yes, talking to other artists, looking at magazines, Plein Air Magazine is a wealth of a range of talents, and it, again, though, it's one of those things that you can learn from someone who's a beginner as much as you can from a master, just by listening to what they're saying and often being reminded of, oh, yes, I've been overlooking that. That's interesting what this so-called beginner said. So,
well, one of the values of an event like going to the Plein Air Convention or going to the Adirondacks or Fall Color Week or one of those events we do is when you're around 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 other artists, and you may be painting in the same place. As you know, in the Adirondacks, we typically go to this one scene that we all paint together, and there's a row of 100 artists that are lined up, and yet if you walk from painting to painting, nobody's doing the same thing. Nobody's doing the same scene. One person is focusing in on a lily pad, another person is focusing on the peak of a mountain. And what it does by being around others is it opens your eyes to other possibilities that you hadn't thought of. The danger in all of that, of course, is to go back to your painting and scrape it off and change it, and go for something different.
Feel that you have to adopt somebody else's style rather than staying true to yourself.
That's right. Yeah. And one of the things I now try to avoid, you probably do the same thing, is if I'm painting with other people, I don't even want to walk over and look at what they're painting, because all of a sudden I'll be, oh, I should have done that in the sky, and start playing with that. You just have to kind of be true to yourself.
You do.
You said something else that I think is a really important aha moment for a lot of people, and that is the idea of magazines and books and really museums. So museums are your friends, and I find that the artists who seem to be the most successful, the ones who are embraced most by collectors, the ones who are financially the most successful, I find that they spend a lot of time in museums. I see that these people will get on an airplane and go to a show. When the Sorolla exhibit was in America, they'd get on an airplane and fly across the country to go see that show and to study those paintings. I find that the artists that have the most success are the ones that are going to the museums more frequently, and they return to the masters. That's right. And they're, in many cases, they're getting permission to go and copy them on location. Talk to me about that.
Well, I think that for me, it was an absolute revelation to see in both Monet and Innes, I think, were huge influences on me when I was young. And it's one thing to study even the most beautiful reproductions, but to study the paintings themselves, to study the surfaces and comparing the two artists. I think of Monet, and where I live in Williamstown, Massachusetts, we're just gifted with the Clark Museum, small museum that has one of Monet's cathedrals and a wonderful Impressionist collection, and also has 9 Inneses. So I'm so lucky to be able to just, a quick aside, there was one time I was out in a field painting, struggling with the edge of a tree line against the sky, and it was driving me crazy. I dropped everything, left my easel sitting in the field, got in the car and drove into the Clark because I knew they had a Corot that was just essentially almost the same scene. And I ran up and looked at the painting, made a couple notes, and I was back in the field painting. I wanted to see how he did it. So that's purely a good fortune of having that kind of easy access. But to see the surfaces especially, I think for both Innes and Monet, I had no idea that when you're young and just accustomed to seeing these little reproductions, that these paintings, it isn't the size of them, it's the looseness, the roughness of the handling of the paint. And it's so clear that they were caught up in the joy of the process and they weren't fiddling with it. It's clear that they just weren't uptight about every brushstroke. There's a certain energy and a getting lost in the process that comes through in the surfaces of their painting. So I think for me, often when I go seeing Sorolla's murals in the Hispanic Society in New York was a revelation. 20 feet by 40 feet. It looks like he was painting these things with a 6-inch house brush.
He almost had to.
And they're so loosely done. And I realized he's not sweating the details. He's lost in the moment, the joy of painting, certainly, but there was absolute method to his madness. There's an energy in the painting and a confidence that I think you just would never get from looking at a reproduction.
Well, you can usually get the answers from the paintings.
Mm-hmm.
But
you can.
If you could sit down with one of those artists from the past, maybe George Innes, what question would you ask him?
That's a great. Maybe I'd first ask him how he reacts when he totally screws up a painting that he thought was going to be a success, a 30 by 40, And I know his attitude was, this isn't working. I'll just try something else. I would love to have gotten into his head about the way he composes his scenes and his value structure. There are several paintings I've seen of his in which I think they presage they're so far ahead of their time. The composition is so abstract, and I'm such a huge advocate of painting and of identifying the basic value structure of a scene, those 2 to 5 values, that light sky, dark fields, because I see that in great painting after great painting. Contemporary painters, the old masters, those who really can produce a stunning landscape, always, you can see they have analyzed that value structure and nailed it. They've got it down. Innes's values are all over the map. He'll have black in the clouds and a bright streak here, and yet he pulls it off. I think that, frankly, if I could rephrase or maybe not directly answer your question, I wouldn't ask him anything. I would ask if I could sit and watch him paint for 10 hours. Yeah. That's what I'd like to see. I want to see how he does this, because they say he painted with his fingers. He would use glazes and scumblings and washes and then scrape. Or another one of the great tonalist, probably my second favorite tonalist, is J. Francis Murphy, who would often use scraping as part of his process. Now, I scrape usually out of frustration. I scrape when the painting's not working. And often I'm finding now that leaving some of that on and repainting can create interesting things. But he would actually scrape as a deliberate part of his process. That I would love to see how he worked that. There's so much to learn, so much to learn.
Yeah, and so little time.
In so little time, yeah.
So, I think one of the things that is really important to communicate to people who might be new painters or might be watching this is don't get so invested in your work.
Oh, yeah. I mean, love painting, but don't get invested in the painting. The one you're working on at the moment is put your heart and soul into it. It's your only child. But in reality, you have 10,000 children there in the background waiting. And if this one doesn't work, kick it out the door. I mean, it's done. If this turns out to be the miscreant you wish you hadn't raised, it's time to let go. So put your heart and soul in every painting, But if it's not working, you have to be willing to just not take it personally and learn from it. Don't get rid of it until you stop and think about what you did. Because if you don't do that, I mean, when you think about a failed painting, they are our best teachers. And in the most concrete terms, they're showing us where we need to work. If your paintings are not working, and you're so embarrassed by that or feel uncomfortable that you just shove them against the wall and don't want to see them and then quickly paint over them, you're really losing some incredible instruction, free instruction right there leaning against your wall. Put the painting up and ask yourself, is it the composition that's not working? Is it the value structure? Is it the way that I'm mixing greens? Our mistakes are screaming at us, and if we don't listen to them, we're not going to improve. I think that became a huge part of my process about 15 years ago. And I think that I could see the quality of my work slowly get better and better, where instead of, if I had a painting that didn't work, I just would let it go. But before I destroyed it, I would look at that painting and I'd go through a list. Is it the composition? Is it what? I had to know what's not working. Because it's telling me, it's right there in front of me. In the most concrete way, it's showing my flaws as a painter. I need to identify those, or I'm not going to know what to work on.
And if you can't see it, put it down.
Wait a year.
Yeah, wait a year.
Yeah, wait a year. The mistakes are still there. Yeah,
they'll jump out at you.
Yeah, it'll jump out at you.
Well, you know, I hear stories of friends taking all their old panels and burning them, you know, because they don't want them in the market if something happens to them. And at the same time, I go through my old panels about once every 2 years, hundreds of them, and I look at them and I learn. First off, it's nice to be able to look back. You know, we in our culture, we tend to always look forward to see what's ahead. But if we turn around and we look back and see what we've accomplished, then, you know, there's not so much pressure.
Yes.
And right. So to go back through your panels, it gives you encouragement because you see what you've accomplished, you see how much you've grown, but you also can see mistakes that you couldn't see back then when you painted them that you may have only learned this particular year.
Yeah, this week. Yeah, that's right. No, it's absolutely, yeah, that's right.
I've had moments where I've been totally frustrated by a painting and I've taken a bunch of just black paint and just out of anger, you know, gone over it, and then realizing, gee, this was stupid, and then I wipe it down, and I ended up with one painting ended up with this wonderful highlight inside the texture of the brush strokes, and it just made the whole thing come alive, and that unified color, in spite of the fact that it tied it all together. And I knew a painter who once used to do that. He would, after he did everything, he glazed with a color that unified everything. Do you ever do anything like that?
I do that all the time. In fact, I even now jokingly refer to it as creative destruction. So if I have a painting that's not working, you know, 5 years ago, I would, after breaking 3 brushes, you know, and cursing my poor luck of having no talent, then I would just scrape it. You know, I'd scrape the whole thing and set it against the wall. Now instead, if I really decide that I've learned what I need to from this painting, I messed up the composition. Okay, I might as well stop right now. But instead, what I'll often do is take a roll of paper towels and simply wipe maybe the sky and then wipe paint off some of the, trying to keep the major value shapes together. Yeah. And then if that doesn't bring the painting together, and often it can, what I'm finding it often does is it brings, if I have too many value variations in these shapes, it'll bring those values together. It eliminates all the details, so I'm no longer distracted by that. It will, by wiping certain areas, tie the colors together. I'm essentially blending the colors. And if that doesn't quite bring it back, then I'll start to wipe more. And I'm finding that usually with about each layer of wiping reveals a different painting. And sometimes, and it happens, I don't know, maybe 1 out of 4 or 5 times, I'll be able to take that back to a stage that I say, there's a good painting in there. And I'll go back and rework the painting and sure enough end up with a successful painting. So it's so important not to despair, not to give in to despair. and simply say, okay, what did I do wrong? Identify that, but then, scrape the painting, put a single color over it, wipe it. You have nothing to lose but a mediocre painting, which is nothing to lose.
So as a painter, what do you think is the most important lesson you ever learned, and who did you learn it from?
Wow. Strangely enough, I would say the most important lesson that maybe was a turning point in my realizing that this is something I can learn and I can do this was about 20 years ago from Cézanne, who I read, and it may be apocryphal, or I may have been mistaken, but I seem to have read someplace where he would take 1 or 2 brush strokes and clean his brush, step back and look, 1 or 2 brush strokes. And like John Singer Sargent, whose paintings look as if they were painted in a virtuosic frenzy, and they said that wasn't how they were painted at all. He actually was very deliberate with a brush stroke. He'd go back and look at it and then scrape it and then do it again. From Cezanne, from Sargent, I learned to slow down. And I saw the quality of my work take a substantial leap forward within a couple weeks just by, instead of, as I used to do, paint for 10 or 15 minutes because it's so much fun and oh, this is great and I just love this. And then I'd finally step back and I think, whoa, there are 10 mistakes in here and they're all interacting with each other. I simply decided to slow down. So now I will take no more than, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 brush strokes, paint for 15, 20 seconds, step back. 15, 20 seconds, step back. I found actually my productivity go up because I was making so fewer mistakes that were fatal to the painting. I caught mistakes early, and then I could see one mistake that would jump out rather than so many mistakes in the canvas that I couldn't tell what was good and what wasn't good.
Well, and they say Sargent wore out the carpet because he stepped back so much.
Exactly.
Well, one trick that I've learned is that sometimes I'll put the paper towel in the back so that every time I need to wipe out my brushes, I have to walk to get a new piece of paper towel because I forget to step back.
To step back. It's huge. We can slow down. We don't get points for being first to finish. You don't. And I think it's particularly difficult painting plein air. When the scene, you know those colors are going to change in 20 minutes. Yes, then go to that area first just to get the color down. But I find myself having to, especially plein air, say slow down, slow down, slow down, because it's always better to end the day with an unfinished painting that's really working than a painting that's quote unquote finished that's a loss. Because you rushed it. You rushed it. Don't rush. There's no hurry. Yeah.
So for somebody who might be watching this and is early stage painter, just beginning, just learning, what's the best advice you can give them?
A beginner. Patience. Be patient. Think long term. These skills, you can develop these skills. Talent. One of my favorite quotes that I wish I could I don't know who said it. I wish I could attribute it to him or her. But in the long run, perseverance and talent are indistinguishable. In the long run, perseverance and talent are indistinguishable. So don't despair that you weren't born gifted with Sargent's, ability. I certainly wasn't. But through just steady work and tapping into the joy of painting, the fact that you want to do this, being willing to create a lot of bad paintings in the process and learning from them, patience, but do work that's meaningful for you. Because this endeavor is so, it takes so many years and decades to really begin to master all of this. And we produce bad paintings and we produce good paintings. We have good weeks, bad weeks. We have good years and bad years. And we all have had months on end where what is going on? I can't seem to make the right decisions. That can take its toll and can really destroy the joy and the passion that drives your painting. So if you're not doing meaningful work, and by that I mean if you haven't found that landscapes are your thing, or still lifes, or I want to do nothing but paint the figure for the rest of my life because it creates an energy and a passion in me that it seems not like it's not work. If you can't tap into that, you will not have the energy to get you through those low moments. And we all have lots of them. I will do 2 bad paintings a week. I'll have 2 bad weeks in a 6-month period, and I'll have 2 bad months in a 2-year period. And I know when I see them coming that I just got to gut it out. You just get through it.
Well, you also have to remember that with the dark clouds comes the rain exactly. That renourishes. And one thing that painters oftentimes don't realize is the bad is good.
That's right.
That when you're going through the bad, it's actually pushing you to a new level. Usually, if a painter wants to go from here to here, there's that period of storm in between. Peter
Right.
Drucker talks about it in business, and it's true in all things because you're pushing yourself,
Right.
and what it does is it's challenging you. So look at the bad as something you have to go through rather than letting your ego get in the way.
Absolutely, and I always think of it as a circle. If in the center is our expertise, and on the edge is the unknown, by definition, trying something new, learning something, means we don't know how to do it, or it wouldn't be learning. Well, when we don't know how to do something and we're on the edge of our knowledge zone, we're also on the edge of our comfort zone. And it doesn't feel good to make mistakes and be frustrated week after week if you're trying something new. But we have to just understand that's part of the process. Because if we only did things that made us feel good, if we only work continually from our strengths, we're going to be doing the same paintings in 20 years as we're doing right now.
That's right.
And what's the point of that? Yeah. I think that often getting accustomed to, we never have to like that discomfort, of being on the edge out of our comfort zone, of failing, and again, I always consider it like free falling. I feel like I'm free falling. I don't know what the heck I'm doing, and this painting is crashing down, and it's so frustrating. And at that moment, I at least can stop and say, boy, I'm in a good spot. This is rich, because this is where I need to be if I'm going to learn anything. I have to get accustomed to feeling those feelings of discomfort when we're out of our comfort zone. That's what learning is about. It's part of it. It's part of it. Can't avoid it.
So what have we not talked about that we should talk about?
The current state of the art market. Yeah.
That'll change. It'll ebb and flow.
The state of landscape painting. I've begun thinking more and more that landscape painting, especially plein air landscape painting, is one of the most radical things we could be doing right now as artists in this day and age. And you think, oh, radical art are those crazy things, the really far out things that you see Sotheby's selling for $50 million, or you see at Mass MoCA, where I live, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art. And again, not to criticize those artists, there's room enough in art for everything. It's a huge field. It can accommodate everything. But I think that we as plein air landscape artists, or as landscape artists, don't appreciate often enough. In our current time and culture, I think we're actually rather radical. To paint on location means that we're more concerned with experiencing this beautiful environment of ours, which is endangered, and celebrate the beauty of that. I think in general to paint landscapes is to celebrate our connection with the earth, to celebrate beauty, which I think in the contemporary arts circles is looked at as with a little, bit of an askance eye. Can seem awfully naive. We're representational artists. I think that at this time in art history, where what is considered the cutting edge of art is so opposite from where we are, I almost feel like we've come full circle. And we are doing what I think is pretty radical, going back to the past and really connecting with a lot of that.
Historically, that's always what happens, is what becomes radical then goes out of style and something else new comes in style, and sometimes it's something from the past. This is a very interesting observation that you've made, because the plein air movement is the largest movement today in the history of art, ever. There always were plein air painters, at least going back as far as Constable and probably a little further back than that. But there weren't large groups of people who painted. Probably the largest group of plein air painters back was when the Impressionists were painting together, and there were 5 or 6 of them. And then there were some small groups of people, Willard Metcalf painting in Connecticut, and there were some small groups of people there, and there were some small groups of people in California. But today, there are more people painting in plein air than together. I mean, if you think about the plein air convention, the most recent one, which had 1,000 painters in one location painting in San Diego, it was a phenomenon.
Yeah, that's unique in the history of art. It really is. Yeah.
And you look at the number of people who are plein air painters. Some are professionals, some are midway there, some are amateurs. None of that matters. What matters is that they're enriching their souls, they're enriching their lives, they're expressing themselves creatively. They have this community where they're together as a whole. And to be a part of that is magnificent. And people will look back on this time. Jean Stern, who's an art historian at the Irvine Museum, says that this may be the most important art movement in the history of art because there's so many people plein air painting.
I can believe it. And I think part of that too is what I consider the deprofessionalization of painting. As someone who considers myself a professional artist, it's what I do for a living, and I make my income off of it. I'm aware, though, that too often professionals in the field, whether they want to or not, because of their very expertise, can serve as a deterrent for beginners to even pick it up and try it. We live in a culture that's so focused on success that only if you succeed does it matter what you did. And always the focus is on the outcome, forgetting that the process of just painting, someone who is a joyful painter as a beginner, what I experience painting and what they experience is absolutely identical. That joy knows no hierarchy. That passion knows no hierarchy. And I think that what I've seen, this plein air movement, is it's giving permission, an overused cliche, but it's giving permission to people to be beginners again and to pick up and enjoy something in the moment, the process while they're doing it, and not compare themselves incessantly to the so-called masters at the top of the field. Because so much through history has been, the Monets, we worship the Monets and the Sargents, but how many times have that worshiping them has discouraged people from picking up a brush and trying it? I could never draw, I could never paint. And in reality, you can. And with very little instruction, you can come up to a very simple level of competence that can give you great joy. That's one of the other attributes of this whole great plein air movement that I think is just absolutely terrific. It's getting people on the streets and saying, you have a creative birthright, and you have a right as just a human being to go out and experience your own creative prowess. Do it, do it.
And my plein air studies are my most valued possession other than my family. And I won't sell my plein air studies because I can look at that painting and relive the moment when a deer went leaping through the woods, or when there was something going on, freezing cold out painting the windmills in Holland. And so those are things that people can experience in their lives, and that it enriches their lives. I think with all movements, there's always an old guard. Mm-hmm. And the old guard doesn't want anything to change. And the old guard in the plein air movement doesn't like the fact that there are all these people coming into it and all these people learning to paint, because their attitude is, well, this is going to dilute the marketplace, this is going to make the cost of paintings go down, this is going to put new competition, and some of those things are true, and we have to be careful about that. That's why I'm constantly pushing quality, that everybody needs to pursue quality with vigor, that they have to really go out and try to always elevate themselves, because we don't want plein air painting to mean bad painting.
That's right.
We want plein air painting to mean this is something you've done on location. It's something that it doesn't have to be a finished painting. But most of the people who are doing this are never going to be professionals. They're never going to sell a gallery. They're people who just want the joy of being out there, enjoying nature. Maybe they're not golfers, maybe they're not people who hike, but they're people who love to be outdoors, and they're creative, and they want to get their expression onto that canvas. And that's a special thing.
That is a special thing. And I would even, in terms of the market, I would counter that to have these plein air events in all the different towns and cities across the country, you are exposing to everyone in that town painting and what it means and the process, and inciting curiosity, and chances are you're creating a market. You are creating future buyers of those paintings, if not the onlookers, even though the beginner painters, those who try it and maybe continue to paint and never get in a gallery, but odds are they will themselves become a collector later. So I don't see any downsides.
There's no downside. When we started Plein Air Magazine, there were probably not 5 plein air events across America. Today there are hundreds of events that are attracting people from the local community who are going home and putting original art into their homes instead of posters or reproductions.
Right.
And as I've been to your studio, I know that when you're surrounded by original artwork, it completely changes the nature of your environment. Yeah. And so we're enriching lives for other people, and some of them are interested and they want to learn how to do it. It's amazing to me how many collectors are now becoming plein air painters because they have gone to these events and somebody has done a workshop and they've been inspired. And so it's making everything better, I think.
I think so too. These are skills that can be learned. Yeah.
Well, this has been a fabulous time together.
Yeah.
I'm really excited about what I've learned from you, and I'm very complimentary of what you've done. I'm a big fan of your artwork, and I think that we're all going to grow by observing what you do.
Well, thank you. I'm still learning a lot. So much to learn. Yeah. Thank you very much.
That was from Poetic Landscapes with John MacDonald. Hope you enjoyed it. You can learn more about it at lilyartvideo.com. I'm Eric Rhodes. Thanks for watching.
John MacDonald's paintings draw people into the scene. His paintings make the viewer feel the scene, the warmth of the sun on their skin or the cold snow crunching beneath their feet. In Poetic Landscapes with John MacDonald, you'll discover how John paints emotion into his landscapes, how he uses color, value relationships, and the quality of light to capture a certain mood. You'll soon understand how John uses composition, a focal point, and tonal paint to guide the viewer into his paintings and into a feeling or an experience.
So what is a painting? A painting is a construction. It has parts, components, and a process. Different artists have different lists of what the parts of a painting is, but most 4, 5, 6 items, most agree on the essentials. And they are composition, values, or more specifically a value structure, colors, more specifically color relationships, edge contrasts, and details. Those are what I see as the 5 components of a painting. But what's crucial to understand is that these are not all equal. There is a hierarchy.
Artists are often taught that painting from a photo will never work, that it's impossible to capture the amazing beauty of nature from a flat picture, which could distort color, condense values, and make it hard to distinguish shapes and shadows. And a camera absolutely cannot record the excitement you feel when visiting a scenic landscape. But many landscape artists would like to be able to paint in the studio from photos.
The point of using photographs is not to find one photograph you can copy, but a variety of photos that all give you visual information, and hopefully one photograph that can capture enough of the value relationships that you can use that as information regarding the values and the details. As I mentioned, that being, I think, the best advantage of using a photo.
John will show you how to have the best of both worlds, to enjoy nature while you're there, and to set yourself up to later capture that beauty on canvas in such a way that as you paint, you'll feel like you're right back there, enjoying every moment and taking in everything nature offered you. And whether or not you paint fully on location or also paint in the studio, soon you'll be creating more dynamic paintings that draw the viewer's eye in to feel the emotion that you've painted. Poetic Landscapes is available on DVD or digitally for your computer, tablet, or smartphone. Order yours today and start adding captivating emotions to your paintings.